The people of the devil's doctrine hiding in the mountains, hiding in the countries of the central plains like rats, and fanning the flames like women, disgusted me, so I left again. The old monk's face showed a strong look of mockery and disgust. He was like a woman in the marketplace who looked at other people selling vinegar with 2 bowls of water, full of pride and disdain. I went to the great river of the South Jin Kingdom, to the Yueluan Kingdom, and finally to the west, to the faraway unknown place. In the Xiankong Temple, I finally heard the preaching of the chief monk, saw the clear Buddha light, and heard the deafening words of Buddha. However, after a few years, I finally realized that the monks in the Xiankong Temple were just some filthy things. The so-called words of Buddha were deliberately mystifying, and they were no different from the fortune-tellers on the streets of the Kingdom of Song. What was even more disgusting was that the Buddhism sect cultivated themselves so that they could only wait humbly in the face of the transfer of fate. How could they reach the other side like this? The old monk's white eyebrows floated up and then fell back down. His eyes were full of dissatisfaction, like a young scholar who stopped the Prime Minister's sedan chair on the road and asked how to pull himself together if the country was not at peace. Obviously, his impression of the unknown place of the Buddhism sect was much better than his impression of the front gate of the devil's doctrine. However, he was still angry at the other party's lack of ambition. Finally, I returned from the wilderness and officially accepted the invitation of the hierarch to secretly join the West Hill Divine Palace. With the help of my trusted followers in the devil's doctrine, I killed 2 extremely stupid elders. Only then did I reveal my identity and sit on the black jade throne of judgment. Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan had been listening in silence. Finally, they could not help but ask, since you are a member of the devil's doctrine, why did you help the West Hill Divine Palace to kill your own elders? If I didn't do that, how could I win the trust of Haotian Taoism? If I didn't do that, how could that shabby temple let me, a successor of the Xiankong Temple, read their treasured books? However, that shabby temple was extremely stingy. Even though I did so many things for Haotian Taoism, they only let me read the Ri hand scroll and the Xia hand scroll. The old monk said coldly, even though I only read 2 volumes of the tomes of arcane, they are indeed extraordinary. I thought I had finally found the right place and had the opportunity to understand the real world. However, after staying on Peach Mountain for a few days, I found that the West Hill Divine Palace is a group of cowardly idiots. He suddenly looked down and saw that Yi Hongyu's eyes were already filled with anger. He knew that his mockery of the West Hill Divine Palace had angered the girl. He could not help but laugh and said, "Poor child, am I wrong to say that? Hundreds of millions of Haotian disciples in the world only know about the Divine Hall but not the Jisho Abbey. Those sitting in the white temples on Peach Mountain should know what they should do if they had the courage and backbone. But how did they do it? They look high and mighty, but in the end, they are being ordered around by a shabby Taoist temple." Thinking of the cyan robe in that shabby Taoist temple, the old monk's expression slightly froze. Then he said mockingly, "They are all a group of dogs. So what if it is that shabby Taoist temple? After all, they are still dogs raised by Haotian. They are all dogs." Arrogant laughter burst out from his dried lips that were stained with blood. The old monk's white eyebrows flew up as if they were dancing. He was full of heroic spirit and looked like a young swordsman who was walking in the countryside with a sword in hand, looking for injustice. The slightly hoarse but full of heroic laughter echoed in the quiet and dim room. Ning Ke stared blankly at the old monk who was leaning forward and backward on the White Bones Mountain as if he would fall at any time. He could clearly feel the wild meaning in the laughter. He could not help but think that this person was indeed qualified to call youngest uncle a friend back then. It was indeed somewhat reasonable. After walking in the world for so many years and searching for so many years, there are still dogs everywhere. After thinking about it, I still think that the great divine priest of light who founded the devil's doctrine was interesting, so I returned to the devil's doctrine. The old monk said indifferently, however, I did not expect that after so many years, the devil's doctrine is still as dirty as it was back then. The good-for-nothing who occupied the position of suzerain became more and more senile and muddle-headed. He even wanted to abolish the inheritance of the saintess of the devil's doctrine because he could not bear to part with his own daughter. The rest of the people were even more immersed in the boring pleasure of killing. They were as boring as beasts. At this time, I finally found a glimmer of hope in the front gate. It was a little boy. I saw in him the possibility of reviving the devil's doctrine and changing the whole world. However, it was a pity that I killed his father in order to establish my authority after returning to the front gate. Therefore, he did not believe anything I said at all. I brought back so many wonderful skills from the holy land of Buddhism and Taoism, but he refused to learn them. Instead, he insisted on learning the 23-year cicada cultivation that had no hope of success. The old monk recalled the past and shouted angrily, "My only hope was shattered again. What should I do?" Finally, I thought of a way. I wanted to destroy the world, the devil's doctrine, Buddhism and Taoism, and let the world return to peace. However, from the scorched earth, new shoots would grow. Only then could I succeed. Ning Ke looked at the old monk who was almost crazy and suddenly asked, "What do you want the world to become? Or do you want to destroy the world because you can't stand the sight of it?" The old monk gradually restrained his anger and regained his calmness. He said, "You have not even seen what the world looks like. How are you qualified to discuss the transformation of the world with me?" After a moment of silence, Ning Ke said, "Since you have traveled all over the world to find a way to change the world, why did you not go to the academy? I think the academy back then should not be worse than the places you have studied." The old monk said after a long silence, "There is already a guy called Koharan in the academy." Ning Ke stared into his eyes and said, "So it is not to change the world at all. You are just jealous of my youngest uncle. You want to make yourself stronger and defeat him. However, you could not do it. In the end, you fell into despair and wanted the whole world to die with you." The old monk was slightly stunned and then laughed as if he had heard the funniest thing in the world. He rubbed his shriveled abdomen with his empty hand and said, "Why would I be jealous of a madman?" Ning Ke did not laugh. He looked at him calmly and said, "You are a madman." The old monk was silent and then sighed softly. He said, "You are right. I am indeed a little jealous. People like me, who cultivate both Taoism and Diabolism, can become a Vedanta in the Xiankong Temple, a divine priest in the Peach Mountain, and the most powerful great priest in the devil's doctrine. I don't have the right to be humble. I always thought that I was a peerless figure in 1,000 years, but who would have thought that I would meet a guy who is even more incredible than me?" The old monk sighed and said, "I once learned the lotus imprint of Xiankong Temple and comprehended it on my own as if I was born. I once learned the confinement formation of Peach Mountain and could trap everything in the world with a wave of my fingers. I am proficient in all the skills of the 7 sects and 28 schools of the devil's doctrine and even the practice of Tao Tai that had been lost for a long time. I even read 2 volumes of the tomes of Arcane and comprehended Haotian's divine will. If it wasn't for the fact that I didn't want to be a dog, I could have Tianqi at any time. Do you think I am a cultivation genius?" Every time Ning Ke heard a sentence, his heart trembled. He thought carefully that he had never seen such a powerful cultivator in his life. Even Master Yen Sei and second brother seemed to be far inferior to him. It seemed that such a person was not a cultivation genius. He said honestly, "You are truly proficient in all techniques. You are indeed an extraordinary person." The old monk laughed at himself and said, "Then do you know how many skills Koharan knows?" Ning Ke was silent. The old monk shook his head slowly and said, "He only knows 1. Ning Ke said in surprise, "1? The old monk said calmly, "Koharan only knows how to use a sword. From the wooden sword that looked like children fighting with each other to the sword that broke through the clouds, they were all his Haran sword." Ning Ke looked at the mottled sword marks on the walls around the room and thought in confusion. If youngest uncle only knew how to use the Haoran sword, then how could he set up such a powerful confinement formation and trap someone like Lotus for decades? The old monk seemed to have sensed his and Mo Shanshan's doubts and said with a smile, "You said that I am truly proficient in all techniques. Then let me tell you, Kuharan is truly proficient in one technique and all techniques. He only knows how to use a sword in his life, but he can transform the sword style into all the Taoism in the world. The confinement formation in this room is one such example. One sword transformed into thousands of Taoism in the world." Ning Ke was shocked and speechless. He wondered how many years it would take for him to reach such a state. The old monk said with a smile, "It is really helpless to meet such a person. Kuharan is not as good-looking as I am. The stupid donkey that he rides is not as good as my horse. His feet sweat so much that they stink when he takes off his shoes. But he likes to pick his feet when he sits down. He has a bad temper too. He even quarreled with the headmaster for 3 days and 3 nights just for a bowl of braised pork. He is such a person, but the world only looks at him. When I travel with him, the world only looks at him. No matter how many shocking things I do, the world only looks at him." The old monk smiled bitterly and raised his left hand to make a single lotus print in front of his chest. He gently stroked Yi Hongyu's head as if he was spoiling a child and continued, "I want to do earth-shattering things because I am jealous of him. But the main reason is that I want to find a way to the Nirvana realm. No matter what I do, he always stands in front of me. So I have to think of a way to kill him." "But he still saw through your plot," Ning Ke said. The old monk sighed and said, "At that time, Wei Guangming almost saw through me. I had no choice but to hide in the devil's doctrine. But I did not expect Kuharan to see through what happened in the Lank Temple and chase after me. At that time, I did not care much about it. I always thought that by gathering the power of the devil's doctrine, would be able to kill him. I was even happy about his arrival and prepared to welcome his death. Before that, I had never fought with Kuharan. I knew he was strong, but I always thought that even if he was the strongest in the world, so what? But I did not expect him to be so strong." The old monk said coldly, "He won because he was strong. People in the devil's doctrine can accept this logic. I can accept losing to him. Even if he killed me with a sword, I would not have any complaints. But he should not have spared me. He should not have spared me." The old monk's skinny face suddenly twisted. His deep eyes were like ghost fire, spewing out hatred. His hoarse voice seemed to come from the underworld as he shouted, "He destroyed my lifelong cultivation and threw me into this dark room. He used my favorite confinement to seal all the chi of heaven and earth, and suppressed me like a monster in this place where I can never see the blue sky for the rest of my life. He made me suffer eternal loneliness and despair. Who can endure decades of isolation and loneliness? Do you know the despair of looking at the light outside the temple every day and counting the days but never counting the end? Do you know how terrible the punishment is to only look at these 4 walls for decades? Do you know that when a person stays alone for a long time, even silence will become the most terrible torture?" The old monk stared at Ning Ke's face with hatred, as if he was looking at the face of that person. His breathing became abnormally rapid because of his agitation, and his voice became more mournful and sorrowful, just like how he felt at that time. "The second place on the weekly list. Please vote for me and feel the first place. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 278. Absolute silence, not a single sound. No ants crawled past, no leaves swayed, nothing at all. In the end, because you wanted to hear sounds too much, your eardrums became extremely sensitive. You could even hear the sounds of the corpses around you rotting. When the sounds of the stomachs of the corpses exploding entered your ears, it was like a clap of thunder. The old monk's shrill voice reverberated in the quiet room, like countless continuous claps of thunder. The corpses in the room had all rotted or turned into dried corpses. As a result, even these sounds were gone. The sounds that made you want to puke a moment ago became the most beautiful memory in the next moment. Do you know this feeling? In the end, you could even hear the sound of your blood flowing in your veins. You could hear the sound of your muscles losing moisture and deforming. You could hear the sound of your stomach shriveling and the sound of your intestines being torn apart. It was amazing, wasn't it? If you listened to it for a long time, you would definitely want to vomit. However, the problem was that you couldn't vomit. The old monk's eyes lost all luster. He was like a stone statue as he recalled the decades of cruel life. He muttered, "No matter how strong a cultivator is, he can't not eat or drink at all. You need to eat something, even if it's something disgusting. If you vomit it out, you will die." The old monk suddenly screamed shrilly, "I know this way of living is crueler than death. When I was imprisoned here by Kuharan, should have committed suicide." However, this seemingly straightforward guy had a mind that was more sinister than the devil. He knew that since I was greedy for a moment of life, I would never be willing to die. He was the real devil. Ning Ke asked after a moment of silence, "What did you eat to survive these decades?" On the mountain of bones beneath the old monk, there were old corpses that had been dried by the dry breeze and white skeletons. Ning Ke's gaze fell upon it and he could not help but frown. Mo Shanshan followed his gaze and found that there were many bone fragments at the foot of the bone corpse mountain. Those bone fragments seemed to be the traces left behind by wild beasts. Suddenly, she understood something. Her body suddenly stiffened and her face became abnormally pale. Looking at the reactions of the two, the old monk laughed loudly. His laughter was shrill and sharp, like a sorrowful old ghost crying with hatred. The drooping skin on his face wrinkled as if he was really crying. However, probably because of the severe dehydration in his body, the tear that was squeezed out from the corner of his old eyes was as turbid as stalactite. Looking at the old and cloudy eyes, listening to the heart-wrenching laughter, and thinking of the old monk being imprisoned in the front gate of the devil's doctrine for decades, even the toughest person would feel sad and sympathetic. However, Ning Ke did not feel this way at all. He looked at the old monk and said, "Sympathy is something that cannot be begged for." The old monk's maniacal laughter gradually came to a stop. His eyes, which were like will-o'-the-wisps, stared at Meng Qi's face. Ning Ke tilted his head and looked at the stone wall. After a moment of silence, he said, "Maybe it's because I encountered too many dangers when I was young. I'm a person who lacks a sense of security. I always think about what if something happens to me. Who raised Sang Sang? What if something happened to Sang Sang? How can I convince myself to continue living? If someone did what you did to Sang Sang, would agonize over how to take revenge. It would be too easy to kill you with one strike. You probably wouldn't be able to hold on for too long even if I cut off your limbs and put you in a sh*t jar. I can't let you suffer for too long. Naturally, I wouldn't be happy." He retracted his gaze and looked at the old monk. He smiled and praised, "Now that I think about your decades, I realize that youngest uncle is indeed a genius who knows how to use one method and many methods. You are also talented in torturing people. I won't sympathize with you. I will learn this method and I just hope that I won't have to use it in the future." The old monk did not know who Sang Sang was, but Mo Shanshan did. She glanced at Ning Quebec. The old monk smiled and did not say anything else. The previous series of questions had already slightly eased the resentment that he had accumulated for decades. He now had more important things to do. He slowly lowered his head and gently moved his dry lips to the girl under his palm. Yi Hongyu looked at the old monk coldly. Her naked skin could not help but bulge out in fear. No one could completely dispel the fear in their hearts as they watched themselves being torn into pieces and eaten slowly. Suddenly, a clear sound rang out in the silent and dim room. Ning Kai pulled out the padao on his back and suddenly sprang up on his knees. He was like a tiger that had been hiding in the long grass all night and had finally found the weakness of its prey. He suddenly pounced towards the old monk in the Bone Mountain. In midair, a cold flash of knife light sprayed out like a storm. He and Mo Shanshan had been controlled by the old monk with one glance. Their sense of perception was severely injured and they could not control any part of their bodies. However, he somehow managed to overcome this obstacle and forcefully control his body. At this moment, the old monk was bent down and ready to chew on Yi Hongyu's flesh. He should not have noticed Ning Kai's movements. It was a great opportunity for a sneak attack. When the old monk saw the flash of knife light from the corner of his eye, Ning Kai's padao was only half a foot away from his neck. No matter how he looked at it, he could no longer prevent death from coming. However, he still saw it from the corner of his eye. When the old monk saw the flash of knife light, his mind moved. Other than the holy light of Haotian, there was nothing in the world faster than his mind. A wave of spiritual power that was not strong but extremely pure emanated from the old monk's eyes. Countless white bones in the Bone Corpse Mountain responded to the aura and flew up. A thick leg bone blocked in front of the snow-white blade light. No one knew which devil's doctrine master left this pure white leg bone. His soul had long been lost, but his strength was still there. When it collided with the saber radiance, a huge crack appeared on it, but it did not break in the middle. The entire room was filled with the confinement array that youngest uncle had set up years ago. The talisman carved by the two senior brothers on the padao could not absorb any chi of heaven and earth. He could not even face the bone directly controlled by the old monk's psyche power. Ning Kai let out a muffled groan. The huge force from the blade directly broke his wrist. His body flew backward and he spat out a mouthful of blood in midair. Amidst the Bone Mountain, the fragments of the white roots that were stimulated by the old monk's psyche power followed closely, hitting his body with crackling sounds like a storm. In an instant, he suffered hundreds and thousands of heavy blows. Fresh blood kept spurting out, and who knew how many bones in his body were broken. With a thud, Ning Kai fell heavily to the ground and spat out another mouthful of blood on his clothes. Fortunately, the storm formed by the white bones fell to the ground after leaving the area of the Bone Mountain and did not attack again. Endless pain came from all parts of his body, as if all his bones were broken. Ning Kai frowned and stabbed the ground with the padao in an attempt to stand up. However, he could not resist the injuries in his body and knelt heavily on the ground on one knee. The old monk's face was pale and his cheeks were sunken. A dim light shone in his eyes and his body swayed slightly. It was obvious that he had paid a huge price to deal with Ning Kai's sneak attack. The power that he had accumulated over the decades and the mouthful of blood had all been used up. However, no matter how weak he was, his palms still held Yi Hongyu tightly. The judgment tactical array that isolated the aura of heaven and earth was the most terrifying existence to cultivators. Because there was no chi of heaven and earth, most Taoist skills could not be used at all. Especially when Master Lotus's gaze contained a supreme state, it could directly injure a cultivator's sense of perception and cause them to be unable to use their consciousness to control their own bodies. A cultivator in such a situation was like a calligrapher who had lost his brush or a musician who had lost his seven-stringed zither. He only had knowledge but lost all his abilities and would definitely fall into complete despair. However, Ning Kai was different from most cultivators in the world. He had just learned to cultivate. In the past 10 years when he was struggling on the edge of life and death, he had never relied on any Taoist skills or flying swords. He had relied on his own body and the 3 blades behind him. Even when his sense of perception was severely damaged by Master Lotus gaze, he did not fall into despair. This was because after countless battles, his control over his body was so strong that it was hard for an ordinary person to imagine. He could even control his body's bones and muscles. During the long conversation earlier, he had been constantly tensing and relaxing his muscles at a high frequency. He wanted his body to truly relax and break away from the control of his sense of perception so that he could respond on his own. It must be said that Ning Ke was indeed a person who was good at fighting. Especially when he was in a seemingly hopeless situation where he was fighting against someone stronger than him, the calmer he was, the stronger his battle awareness became. However, it was a pity that the difference in power between the two of them was so huge that it could not be made up for with just judgment, calculation, and battle awareness. Your control over your body has actually reached such a level? The old monk was slightly surprised as he looked at Ning Ke, who was half kneeling on the ground. His two white eyebrows slowly floated up and he said in a low voice, "Even though the desolate man's body is strong, his consciousness and body are actually not as good as yours. I did not expect this generation's world wayfarer of the academy to be such good material for devil's cultivation. What a pity, what a pity." Ning Ke was seriously injured and could no longer hold the hilt in his hands tightly. His body swayed a few times and finally fell to the ground again. He did not clearly hear what the old monk said. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and coughed in pain. Everything happened too quickly and Mo Shanshan was completely unprepared. Now, she looked at Ning Ke lying in a pool of blood and her eyes were filled with worry. However, she could not go over to see how he was doing. Ning Ke looked at her expression and slowly moved over with difficulty. He sat with his back facing her and coughed in pain again. He panted and said weakly, "I won't die for now, but I really can't move now." The old monk looked at him and the more he looked at him, the more he liked him. He said regretfully, "You are so talented. If you were not a disciple of the academy, I would really want to pass my mantle to you and see how far you can go in the future." Ning Ke used to really think that he was a cultivation genius. However, he had gone through a lot of hardships to enter the cultivation world. Once he entered the cultivation world, he had seen too many true powerhouses, second brother Chen Pipi, a freak, and also met genius girls like the calligraphy addict and the Tao addict. It was only then that he gradually gave up on that idea and realized that his talent in cultivation was only mediocre. So when he heard the old monk's lament, he could not help but feel a little strange. He lifted the corner of his lips with difficulty and said self-mockingly while panting, "Only 10 acupoints in the ocean of qi and mountain of snow can be considered a talent?" The old monk looked at him and said weakly, "If you are willing to cultivate the devil's way, so what if you know nothing?" Ning Ke leaned weakly on Mo Shanshan's back and looked at the old monk in the Bone Mountain. He smiled with difficulty and said, "Master, I am willing to follow you to cultivate the devil's way. Can you let us go? Why do we have to fight to our deaths?" The old monk looked at him with a compassionate gaze and said weakly, "Why are you joking now?" Ning Ke coughed twice and said while panting, "It's not a joke. I can swear on the headmaster's character." The old monk opened his mouth with difficulty and said with a smile, "Kuharan and I have been enemies for a lifetime. I know the true colors of the academy better than anyone else in the world. Others may believe it, but I know that no one from the academy can be trusted." Ning Ke could not help but laugh when he heard this. However, he felt a pain in his chest and started coughing violently again. The old monk looked at him and said in confusion, "You should be able to bear it. Why did you choose that timing to attack? Although that timing was good, it was still a little too early. Wouldn't it be better if you could wait until the moment when I devoured the flesh?" Ning Ke wiped the blood that he coughed out and said, "It was indeed a little too early. It's mainly because I don't like to see you eat human flesh." Hearing the word human flesh, the old monk's expression gradually turned vicious. He said coldly, "I have gnawed on dried bones and meat for decades. In the end, the meat has become dry wood dregs. Do you think it's delicious?" The old monk looked at the young man and woman who were sitting back to back and said viciously, "The human flesh that I ate when I was traveling in the world was either for planning or to make myself stronger. Do you think I am a psychopathic lunatic who likes to eat human flesh? Do you think that human flesh is really delicious?" The old monk thought of the green robe that drifted through the Devil's Hall decades ago and laughed maniacally. Kuharan sealed me in this isolated hell to force me to eat human flesh. Later on, another guy came here. No matter how I begged him, he refused to let me go or kill me. Instead, he picked up a dozen corpses and threw them to me as food. He said that it was Haotian's reward for me. If I am a demon, then what are they? Chapter 279. Ning Ke knew why the old monk suddenly praised the academy. It was because the academy dared to accept someone like him, which required an unimaginable breadth of mind and an attitude of tolerance. Such an academy deserved everyone's admiration. He said proudly, "The academy wins in this world." The old monk said mockingly, "But the academy will eventually become a ruin." Ning Ke said, "Everything in the world is like that, but at least the academy will not become a ruin because of your curse." The old monk looked at this young man who was seriously injured but still proud and confident, as if he was looking at his friend from many years ago. After a moment of silence, he suddenly asked, "How many years has it been since Kuharan died?" Ning Ke was startled and shook his head. "I don't know. I told him that Haran's sword had entered the devil's way, but he did not care. I warned him that if he continued to be so proud, he would be punished by Haotian one day, but he still did not care. Now he must have turned into ashes and scattered across every stream and every mountain in the world. I wonder if he is still so proud now, ha 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 ha." The old monk lowered his head and laughed like a madman. A turbid old tear squeezed out from the corner of his eye. Ning Ke said, "Youngest uncle should be proud even if he died." The old monk raised his head, looked at him, and said coldly, "But he died in front of me, so I won." Ning Ke said mockingly, "Some people die, but he is still alive. Some people live, but he is already dead." The old monk sighed and said, "What a sharp-tongued young man. Will I succeed next time?" Ning Ke suddenly asked sincerely. His body was still trembling slightly under the cotton clothes. Although this method was very exhausting, it was the only way to maintain mobility under the terrifying mental control of the other party. The old monk looked at him and said sincerely, "There will not be a next time." Ning Ke said, "You are indeed the most powerful existence I can imagine. But you, who have been imprisoned for decades, are just a king who has been reduced to dust. I, who am young and strong, am a fierce tiger who has just come down from the mountain. The confinement's isolation of the chi of heaven and earth does not affect me. I am used to doing things with my strength. There is no reason for you to recover faster than me." The old monk smiled and said, "You are indeed sharp-tongued. Unfortunately, I am so old that I have no teeth." With that, he lowered his head and bit down hard on Yi Hongyu's bare shoulder. Yi Hongyu raised her eyebrows but refused to lower her head. She stubbornly watched as the old monk chewed on her flesh. It was as if she wanted to engrave this scene in her mind and never forget it even in the underworld. The old monk did not have any teeth, so he used his gums to chew. It was extremely difficult, like an old toothless lion trying to tear apart a doe with tough skin and flesh. Before the front gate was destroyed, I arranged many things. I arranged for the saintess to go south. I believe that she will do what I asked her to do. I arranged for many disciples to go south. I believe that one of them will do what I asked." The old monk looked at him and smiled. His smile was full of confidence and even dominance. The Enlightenment doctrine was already rotten. I don't feel sorry for it even if it was destroyed by Kuharan. I would rather create a new devil's doctrine on top of the ruins. The new devil's doctrine will be rooted in the fertile land of the Tang Empire. Once it is reborn, it will definitely be a new existence. I believe that these arrangements of mine should be gradually working after such a long time. Then I just need to wait quietly for the headmaster of the academy to die. Then who do you think this world will belong to? Ning Ke felt cold all over. He thought to himself, are there countless powerhouses of the devil's doctrine hiding in Chang'an today? And these people all listen to his arrangements to go south? If this person was allowed to escape from the front gate of the devil's doctrine, how much trouble would there be in the world? But you should have thought that youngest uncle would kill you at that time. Once you die, what's the point of hiding so many backups and arrangements in the Central Plains? The old monk looked at him with slight mockery, like the snow on the peak looking at the insects in summer. He said, even if I die, these arrangements of the past still exist. You mortals never seem to understand that the meaning of a person's life and death is not important. What's important is whether we can change this old world and usher in a new world. Then, we can gather the power of the new world to change some rules. If I can do this, what can I do even if I die? Ning Ke asked, what rules? The old monk replied, the rules of Tao. Ning Ke asked, what if you can't change it even after planning for your whole life? The old monk replied with a smile, at least I've tried. Ning Ke frowned and said, you're willing to let the whole world die just for your attempt? The old monk said calmly, what does the destruction of the world have to do with me? This was probably the source of pleasure for a schemer. Ning Ke thought silently in his heart. He was extremely impressed by the old monk's careful planning in this life, but he was also extremely afraid of it. Because a madman was always difficult to defeat. At this moment, the world-famous Master Lotus was a complete madman in Ning Ke's eyes. He could not understand what he was saying at all. Even if he could understand a little, he would not know which words were true and which were false. He could not even determine what kind of person he was. The light in the room of the Devil's Hall was getting dimmer and dimmer. It was probably night time in the world outside the mountain, and the temperature was getting lower. He looked up at the mottled sword marks on the roof and the stone walls. Those were the sword marks left by youngest uncle, the sword marks that formed a confinement that had trapped Lotus 32 for decades. He sighed softly in his heart. It was just a casual glance. He did not deliberately control his state of mind. It was probably because he had become used to using the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong in the old library. The dense sword marks naturally separated in his vision and gradually became clear. Ning Ke's gaze stayed on those sword marks for a long time. His state of mind followed the marks and gradually developed a certain feeling. This feeling was very obscure, difficult to grasp, and difficult to distinguish, but his body warmed up because of it. Note, the 32 words of Lotus 32 are all from the lyrics of a song, Do Wei's Advanced Animal. Also, I would like to clarify that the main problem with the slow development of the plot is the slow updating. I have been writing seriously and attentively, sleeping in the afternoon and thinking about the manuscript. But the updating is indeed a problem, and I am thinking about how to solve it. Maybe it will explode, or maybe I will not use this name for the time being. Although it is indeed entering the devil, please look forward to it. Also, little Junjun of the high-rise building has started a new book. The book number is 2308671. The disgusting advertisement is below, please go and ravage him. Welcome, to the country of dragons. Welcome, to the world of dragon skills. Come on. Here is the most exciting, most passionate, most hot-blooded gorgeous chapter. Come on. Let us enter the world of dragon soul of heaven and earth together and create a dragon era that belongs to us. To be continued, high-rise building strongest work of the year. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 280. The obscure feeling in his body did not attract much attention from Ning Quebec. He even thought that the warmth came from Mo Shanshan, who was behind him. He just quietly looked at the mottled sword marks on the bluestone roof. He thought of youngest uncle's cool demeanor when he splashed the sword style and thought of his own helplessness as he waited for death. He felt a little ashamed and embarrassed. It was a sad thing to wait for death in despair. People in such situations would usually remain silent. At this moment, Master Lotus did not speak. Ning Ke naturally did not have the mood to speak as well. The room in the Devil's Hall became dead silent. The absolutely quiet environment was just like what Master Lotus had viciously recalled. It was indeed scary if it lasted for a long time. There was no sound of wind or flowers. Ning Ke could even faintly hear the sound of his own lungs expanding and contracting and the sound of his own hair rubbing against each other. He felt that it was very magical, but also very scary. If he could not clearly feel Mo Shanshan's warm and soft body, he might really think that he had arrived at the underworld. Mo Shanshan weakly leaned on his shoulder and asked haggardly, "Are we going to die?" Ning Ke said after a moment of silence, "It seems so." Mo Shanshan frowned slightly and said, "Why can't you comfort me?" Ning Ke coughed painfully and said in a self-deprecating manner, "If I can die a quick death, it is actually considered a comfort." Mo Shanshan understood what he meant. It would be good if she was directly killed by Master Lotus later. But if she was like Yi Hongyu, who watched helplessly as she was eaten, that would be the greatest fear in the world. Thinking of this, the girl's beautiful face suddenly became extremely pale. Her long and sparse eyelashes trembled slightly and her thin lips were tightly pressed into a red line. After a long silence, she looked at Ning Ke's deeply furrowed brows because of his coughing and said with a slightly trembling voice, "In the palace, I said that I like your handwriting." Ning Ke did not know why the calligraphy addict would mention this at this time. After a slight pause, he comforted her with a smile and said, "I know that my handwriting is good. If you want to see it, I can go out and write a few thousand words for you to see." Mo Shanshan smiled and said, "I also said that I like your big black horse." Ning Ke was stunned and said with a bitter smile, "That naughty fellow is really reluctant to give it away. I don't want the big black horse." Mo Shanshan gently bit her lower lip and said softly as if she had made up her mind, "I do like your calligraphy and the big black horse, but I want to tell you something else. I like you." This confession directly turned Ning Ke into a block of wood. He looked at the haggard but still beautiful face close to him, and smelled the faint scent of the girl close to his nose. He was silent for a long time, thinking about how to answer. This was the first time in his 2 lifetimes that he had been confessed to by a man of the opposite sex. This was one of the most touching words he had heard in both lifetimes. Although it was a pity that it happened in the dark front gate of the Devil's Doctrine and at the moment of death, it was still as pleasant as the sound of willow branches rubbing against each other by the lake. Was that the Ink Lake at the foot of Mogan Mountain? The girl on his shoulder was the best in the world in terms of temperament, appearance, and state of cultivation. Many young men secretly admired her but did not dare to say anything. In Ning Ke's eyes, Mo Shanshan could not find any fault with her, except that she was easily misunderstood as aloof and cold because of her poor eyesight. In terms of sect, family, or political background, the Tang Empire and the Great River Kingdom had been on good terms for generations. The headmaster of the academy and His Majesty would definitely be happy to see this. They were a good match. In terms of hobbies, the two could be said to be like-minded. If they were really together, they could spend the long night together splashing ink and appreciating each other's works. Wouldn't that be wonderful? The most important thing was, did he like her? Of course he liked her. A man's love was sometimes very complicated, but most of the time it was very simple. A girl like Mo Shanshan, who was worthy of being liked, should naturally be liked. So was Ning Quebec. It was just that he was about to die in the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, and he still had the mood to think about so many things for so long. When he came to his senses, he could not help but laugh. He always felt that something was wrong. This feeling was very strange. Any background and worldly matters were not important before he died. Moreover, he asked himself if he really liked this girl who was as pure as ink. However, he became more and more vigilant about the strange feeling in his heart. It was as if he was about to take the crucial step before joining the devil. Behind the great beauty was a great fear. What was that fear? Ning Ke himself did not know. He looked at the girl on his shoulder and said helplessly, "Younger sister Shanshan, I like your temperament and appearance, including the way you do things." Logically speaking, at this time, I should not. Mo Shanshan's face did not have the usual shyness after a girl's confession. She only had a gentle and calm expression. She knew why Ning Ke was hesitating. She knew better than this guy himself why he was hesitating. She could not help but sigh softly in her heart. She gently leaned into his arms and murmured, "You are really muddle-headed in some aspects. I just don't want to die, and you don't know my feelings for you. I'm not in a hurry to hear any comfort from you. At this moment, anything you say doesn't count and isn't fair. I'm just telling you this." Ning Ke wanted to refute that he was muddle-headed. However, he thought that he was indeed muddle-headed at this time. Why couldn't he hold this girl in his arms according to his true feelings and tell her that he liked her too? Then he could make up for the regrets of his 2 lives before he died. What was he afraid of? However, he felt Mo Shanshan's feelings and was touched. He softly said, "Then I know." Mo Shanshan smiled contentedly. She slowly closed her eyes and leaned into his arms. She said, "Then this is enough." In the dark and silent room of the Devil's Palace, in the middle of the hill of bones and corpses, a ghost-like old monk gently pressed his palm on the head of a beautiful girl who was covered in blood. It was as cold as winter. However, in the other corner of the room, a young man and a young woman who were about to meet death were gently hugging each other and whispering like small animals. It was as warm as spring. This bloody and cruel but beautiful scene made people's hearts palpitate and move. Beautiful feelings could not make the world truly beautiful. It seemed warm like spring, but in fact, as the night shrouded the mountain outside the Devil's Doctrine, the light in the room became darker and the temperature dropped. The weak Mo Shanshan leaned into Ning Ke's arms and fainted. Ning Ke, who was severely injured, also felt that the heat in his body was gradually disappearing. He vaguely remembered the previous warmth. He instinctively raised his head and looked at the bluestones on the roof again. He suddenly found that the mottled sword marks on the stones did not disappear with the night, but began to emit a faint flame. Youngest uncle had killed the powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine with his sword. His sword was stained with blood, and then he climbed up the stone wall and finally became the ghost fire today? But Ning Ke clearly remembered that ghost fire should be the remains of a rotten corpse, and it should not last for too long. He squinted at the increasingly clear sword marks on the roof and gradually became entranced. Once again, he habitually used the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to solve it, completely forgetting the injuries on his body and even forgetting to cough. The mottled sword marks with a faint flame began to decompose into dense light filaments, and then began to circulate in his field of vision. It was as if he was lying on the grassland and looking at the sky full of stars above his head, beautiful and peaceful. Suddenly, Ning Ke felt a trace of warmth in his body. This time, he did not let the feeling pass, nor did he pay too much attention to it. He just carefully experienced and enjoyed it. The sword marks on the roof flowed according to a certain pattern in his field of vision. The warmth seemed to correspond to it and began to circulate in his body, from his wrist to his neck. Wherever it passed, he felt warm and comfortable. At this time, Ning Ke was in a trance and subconsciously chased after the warmth, trying to dispel the coldness in his body. Correspondingly, his eyes also moved slowly on the sword marks, which were gradually imprinted in his sense of perception. Those sword marks entered his eyes, entered his body, and turned into a warm airflow, passing through his wrist and many joints, entering his internal organs, and becoming some kind of substantial existence, indifferently urging him to stand up. The sword style contained in those marks was so proud. How could it allow itself to despair and surrender in the face of death? So, Ning Ke stood up. He looked up at the sword marks on the roof quietly, as if he did not even know that he had stood up. Mo Shanshan woke up from her coma and looked at him standing in front of her in shock and speechlessness, not knowing what had happened. Ning Ke looked up at the sword marks quietly. He did not know how long he had been looking at them. His pupils gradually became darker and darker, but they were so transparent and crystal clear, as if he had seen an endless abyss when he looked inside. With a clang, he slowly pulled out the padao behind him. He looked at the sword mark flying diagonally forward on the roof and took a step forward with his right foot. He looked at the clumsy and straight short sword mark in the corner and heavily bent his left knee. He looked at the soft and round sword mark on the opposite wall, suddenly turning around and chopping with his padao. The blade buzzed and the air between the blades split apart, causing a strong wind to blow in the quiet room. It was unknown when the old monk had woken up and looked over there indifferently. He had used the practice of Tao Tai to suck 2 mouthfuls of the Tao addict's pure flesh and blood. His cheeks had gradually filled out and the vitality in his skinny body had become extremely vigorous. At this time, Ning Ke was waving his padao in the corner of the room. He focused on the mottled sword marks on the wall and roof, waving the padao in his hand continuously. He did not notice anything else around him, as if he had entered a deep meditation. The old monk sensed that the aura in the sword marks on the surrounding walls was gradually flowing away and then pouring into the young man's body. His indifferent eyes suddenly became fanatical and venomous. He screamed shrilly, "You are already dead. Do you want the broken sword you left behind to come back to life?" The old monk's cheeks, which had just become a little more plump, suddenly sank. His right hand, which was like a ghost's claw, pointed at Ning Ke, who was still in a daze. It looked like he wanted to kill Ning Ke at the cost of his essence and blood. Mo Shanshan was the first to react. She forcefully supported her weak body and reached behind her to hold a few hard objects tightly. Yi Hongyu, who had been silent under the old monk's withered palm, suddenly raised her head. Her hands, which were supporting herself on the broken bones, trembled slightly. Her cold eyes were filled with a sense of self-abandonment. There will be an important chapter later. Please read it and give your comments. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 281. Before she lifted her head, Yi Hongyu glanced at Ning Ke without any emotions in her eyes. At that time, Ning Ke was holding a long padao and waving it along the sword marks on the walls and ceiling. He was in a daze and was in a daze. He felt awkward and clumsy when he used his padao as a sword. He looked like a muddle-headed idiot. Yi Hongyu saw that he was seriously injured by Divine Lord Lotus. He should have been lying on the ground, but now he was waving his padao. She did not know what had happened to him, but she could vaguely guess that he had encountered an opportunity and was in the process of enlightenment. The hopeless situation finally showed a small gap with Ning Ke's opportunity. She knew that Divine Lord Lotus would not give Ning Ke any chance, but she had to grab hold of this last chance. So she started to sob. Accompanied by her sobs, the tattered but still bright red dress on her suddenly lost all its color and became pale, as if all the breath of life and blood had been sucked away. Her pale face became abnormally bright red, and the corners of her eyes and nose were blood red like flowers. She was incomparably charming. 2 streaks of blood-red tears flowed down from the corners of her eyes, and the black hair that draped over her back suddenly rose and danced wildly in the air. Her state, which had been suppressed by the confinement array and Divine Lord Lotus' powerful psyche, had somehow returned to her body. The dark room was filled with the aura of a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state. The knowing destiny state only appeared for a very short moment, and then it rapidly dimmed. Like a weed that was pressed down by a stone mountain, it only had time to push away the stone and look up at the clear blue sky before it was pressed back down pitifully. The state had suddenly returned and disappeared, but it did not end there. The collapse of the knowing destiny state in her body was not because the aura of the state was suppressed, but because the state itself was moving downwards. It went all the way down and broke through the lower end of the state. Her cultivation state had returned to the see-through state. She had clearly entered the knowing destiny state. How could she force herself to return to the see-through state? Cultivation in the world had always been about climbing up step by step. Who would turn around and go down the mountain? Even if there were lunatics who were willing to lower their state, how could they do it? You are already taller than the short willow next to the girls' dormitory in the Revelation Institute. You can already jump over 2 stones in the lake that are far apart. How can you be lower than the willow and not be able to step on the stone in front of you? No one could understand what was happening right now. Why would Yi Hongyu do this? She had gone through a lot of hardships to find the most suitable opportunity to enter the knowing destiny state. Why did she return to the see-through state in such an obviously dangerous way? What did she want to do? Then, something incredible happened. Yi Hongyu raised her head and stared at Divine Lord Lotus. Her cold eyes were filled with determination and determination. The red dress on her body suddenly turned pale and her state dropped to the see-through state. A majestic and powerful aura surged from her body and broke through the mind control from the palm above her head. It charged towards the old monk's body. One state would never drop naturally. It was rare to hear of any cultivator who could drop their state by themselves. However, Master Lotus was well versed in Taoism and Devil's Law. He knew what Yi Hongyu was trying to do when the aura on her body changed. The West Hill Divine Palace had a powerful Taoist law. This Taoist law could allow cultivators to drop their state by themselves. Once this Taoist law was used, the aura that the cultivator had comprehended from the upper state would be released in an instant. The powerful psyche that had been accumulated through decades of hard work and meditation would form a terrifying impact once it was released. However, the price to pay for this Taoist law was too high. The state that the cultivator had gone through a lot of hardships to comprehend was even more important than their lives and families. Who would be willing to give it up and start from scratch? Furthermore, after using this Taoist law, it would be many times more difficult for a cultivator to re-enter the original state than when they first broke through the state. To the powerhouses of the Divine Hall who were qualified to come into contact with this Taoist law, no one would be willing to use this Taoist law on the long road of cultivation. This was more painful and sadder than asking them to die. The powerhouses of the Divine Hall who used this Taoist law would definitely fall into a situation that was more terrifying than death. It required great courage and determination. Note, Yi Hongyu, the Tao addict, was already a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state. She was undoubtedly the most powerful person in the younger generation in the world. However, at this moment, she did not hesitate to force her state to drop from the knowing destiny state to the see-through state. She did not care about the price and reputation she had to pay. Because she was in a situation that was more terrifying than death and colder than the underworld. She saw a glimmer of hope, so she did not hesitate to use death to fight for this chance. In this cold room without a trace of chi of heaven and earth, what else could she do other than burning her own state? The gap between the knowing destiny state and the see-through state was the storm-like aura that surged from her body. It was the distance of half a foot between the old monk's palm and her head. The storm-like aura suddenly approached him. The old monk's body shook slightly and the finger that was pointing at Ning Ke trembled. He looked indifferent and looked down at the girl who was looking at him stubbornly. There was no human emotion in his deep eyes. He did not expect Yi Hongyu to know such supreme Taoism skills at such a young age. If he knew that this girl from Haotian Taoism was also known as the Tao addict, he would not be so shocked. His dry lips were chanting a spell, and his right hand formed a single lotus mudra in the air. A holy light lit up between his fingers like a candle, and the divine breath of the Tao and the devil instantly occupied the entire White Bone Mountain. With the forceful suppression of the divine skill, the old monk's skinny palm slowly pressed down on the top of Yi Hongyu's head. Inch by inch, it seemed slow but unstoppable. Yi Hongyu did not lower her head. She stared coldly into the old monk's eyes and bit her lips tightly. She blasted out all the power that she had obtained when she descended to the state, trying to stop the skinny palm from descending. She used both her hands to support herself on the ground. A few broken bones had already pierced deep into her palms. The pain made her even more clear-headed and stubborn. Her slender wrists trembled violently and looked like they could break at any time. However, she stubbornly supported her body. Her body was also trembling violently as if she could collapse at any time. However, she stubbornly refused to collapse. The two terrifying forces inside and outside of her body clashed and pressed against each other. Blood slowly seeped out from the tiny pores on her delicate face. Then, it condensed into tiny beads of blood and finally dripped onto her pale dress that had lost its original color. However, the skinny palm continued to descend mercilessly and slowly. Inch by inch, even though she had paid such a huge price and even burned up all her life energy, her state was too far away from the divine Lord Lotus and she still could not stop it. At the last moment, Yi Hongyu glanced at Ning Ke emotionlessly. At this moment, Ning Ke was still holding the padao and comparing it to the Haoran sword mark on the stone wall. Sometimes, he danced and sometimes, he hugged the padao and was deep in thought. His mind was elsewhere and he did not know what was happening. I have tried my best. If you still do not wake up, I have no other way. Yi Hongyu looked at Ning Quebec. Her eyes that were bloodshot and looked even more enchanting were filled with a strong sense of despair. She thought, you idiot. When are you going to wake up? Then, she closed her eyes. The skinny palm finally landed on top of her head. The old monk looked at the young girl under his palm with a solemn and complicated expression. His previously plump cheeks had already sunk in and the skinny man had returned to being a ghost. He snorted softly and channeled all the mental strength that he had accumulated for decades into her. A strong aura shot out from the edge of the skinny palm. The dancing black hair returned to Yi Hongyu's shoulders gently and quietly. She slowly fell to the ground and 2 streaks of red tears flowed from the corner of her eyes. However, she still looked at the old monk's face coldly and stubbornly. The old monk's face was slightly pale and his body swayed slightly. In order to completely subdue Yi Hongyu who had burned up her life energy, it was obvious that he had paid a huge price. Things did not end there. What made the old monk feel slightly uneasy and vigilant was not the young girl under his palm, but Ning Ke who was wielding his knife and sword. That was because the sword he was wielding was the Haoran sword. He raised his skinny palm again and pointed at Ning Ke who was immersed in the sword style and unaware of what was happening around him. Even when Yi Hongyu had displayed such a terrifying Taoist law previously, Lotus still did not exhaust all of his power. That was because he had to reserve enough power to ensure that he could kill Ning Ke before he finished comprehending his swordsmanship. He had to kill Ning Ke with absolute certainty. He could not leave behind any hidden dangers or possibilities. That was why he did not casually glance at Ning Ke this time. Instead, he looked solemn and focused as he pierced his finger through the air. Where his finger pointed, the strong mental strength condensed into something that seemed to be real. It pierced through the silent space and the cold air and pierced straight at Ning Kei's back. At this moment, Ning Kei was holding on to his padao and staring blankly at the sword mark on the stone wall in front of him. His state of mind was empty and dull. He was like an ignorant child watching ants moving house and did not know that there was a stone flying behind him. The Tao addict, Yi Hongyu, had already fallen into a pool of blood. She had lost all her strength and was completely defenseless at this moment. In the face of Master Lotus's vicious and serious finger, it seemed that nothing could save her life. At this moment, a white bone flew up and stopped in front of Master Lotus's mental strength. Even if it was the hard remains of the powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine, it should not be able to withstand Master Lotus' boundless and strong mental strength. That was because how could a tangible object resist an intangible mental strength? However, the dim light in the silent room suddenly bent at that moment. The phosphorescence in the sword mark on the walls and ceiling seemed to be disturbed by an invisible force and floated up at the same time. Although the mental strength was intangible, it still had a sense. At this moment, even the light was disturbed and forced to bend, let alone the mental strength. With a swish, Master Lotus's finger pierced through the air. Ning Kei was still standing blankly with his knife. Two white eyebrows slowly floated up and the old monk looked at the corner of the room in surprise. That was a forgotten corner. There was a forgotten young girl in the corner. From the beginning until now, this young girl had not displayed any amazing state or abilities. She was extremely weak, so Master Lotus did not pay enough attention to her and even forgot her in the corner. But she was Mo Shanshan. Mo Shanshan of Mogan Mountain. She was the calligraphy addict who was as famous as the Tao addict. Therefore, no matter how weak she was, as long as she could still move, she could do things that ordinary people could not do. The old monk looked at Mo Shanshan indifferently and ignored her. He directly pierced through the air towards Ning Quebec. Mo Shanshan lowered her head and sat cross-legged on the ground. She was so weak that she could collapse at any time. Her right hand took out a stone from behind her and seemed to throw it away casually. However, it blocked the power of the finger. The old monk frowned slightly and raised his skinny little finger. The psyche power between his fingers pierced through her heart. Mo Shanshan's fingers moved slightly and a handful of scattered white bone pieces flew in front of her. Then, she lowered her head and coughed painfully. Blood soaked the front of her cotton robe. After calculating the front gate hidden tactical array by the lake for a few days and helping Ning Kei to break the remnants of the Devil's Doctrine's front gate tactical array, the young talisman master's psyche power was on the verge of drying up. Previously, her sense of perception had been severely injured by Master Lotus. But now, she supported herself strongly and used everything around her to set up an array in an attempt to stop Master Lotus. Those white bone pieces were not talismans, but arrays. Most of the arrays in the world were talismans that could change shape. They needed to sense heaven and earth and mobilize the aura of nature. At this moment, because of the suppression of the confinement tactical array, no chi of heaven and earth could be sensed in the dark room. Therefore, the array that she was setting up now was different from ordinary arrays. When that great person modified and realized this array 1,000 years ago, the original intention was not to be close to heaven and earth, but to compete with heaven and earth. Therefore, this array was not originally used to mobilize the chi of heaven and earth. Instead, it was used to cut the chi of heaven and earth, or even to cut and block heaven and earth itself. At this moment, there was no chi of heaven and earth in the room, so this array could not cut and block the chi of heaven and earth. However, it could cut and block any other invisible force, such as the psyche that Master Lotus had cultivated with 2 mouthfuls of blood and 10 years of imprisonment. This array was called Stone Array Tactics. At this moment, the dozens of white bones that were lying between the old monk and Ning Kei were what Mo Shanshan had comprehended when she was outside the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. Although it could not be compared to the real stone array tactics, it was powerful enough. Master Lotus's expression became more and more solemn. He felt a strong sense of uneasiness and the shadow hidden in the rotation of fate. That young man had comprehended the Haoran sword style that was left behind by Kuhaoran. That young girl from the Taoism sect could actually perform such a powerful and fierce Taoist art of lowering one's state. And this girl who looked weak and harmless could actually comprehend the stone array tactics. The old monk's skinny palm was like a lotus flower. The jade petals bloomed, and every petal was an extremely powerful psyche power attack. The girl picked up the white bone pieces and the stones that fell from the wall, and continuously repaired the array that she had just comprehended. Ning Ke was in the simple array that was formed by the white bones and stones. He held his knife and meditated. In the serene hall, the sound of something breaking through the air could be heard. The old monk was expressionless, and his eyes were as deep as the netherworld. Fresh blood flowed down from Mo Shanshan's thin lips like a stream, soaking the thick white cotton jacket on her body. Her long and sparse eyelashes trembled slightly on her pale face, as if she could close her eyes at any time. In the pool of blood and scattered bones, Yi Hongyu stared at the old monk's old face. Her eyes were burning with excitement, and her seductive face that was dripping with blood looked weak and crazy. She laughed weirdly and said, "Old monster, continue sucking. Before my blood is sucked dry by you, I want to see who is faster, you or him. I want to see who will survive." Note, about lowering one's state, it can be roughly understood using electronic transition. This is today's first chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 282. Master Lotus looked at her indifferently and suddenly smiled. He lowered his head gently and sucked the blood off her delicate cheeks as if he was sucking the dew off a lotus. Then, he bit off another piece of her flesh. Yi Hongyu's eyes were filled with pain, but she laughed crazily. "You are afraid." Master Lotus ignored her and chewed the third mouthful of blood calmly. He tried to recover his spirit and vitality in the shortest time possible, at least before Ning Ke woke up. In the world decades ago, he was the most terrifying and powerful figure. Today, facing him, three of the most outstanding people of the younger generation in the world had exploded at the same time. They had finally found a glimmer of hope in the midst of despair. They had fought for a chance of survival in the face of death. The strong confidence and perseverance contained in this dangerous process made even Master Lotus, who had seen countless earth-shattering events in his life, palpitate. He had to show his respect by being serious. The key point of the current situation was that when the calligraphy addict risked the collapse of her sense of perception to forcefully build the stone array formation to block Master Lotus's psyche power attack, would Master Lotus use the practice of Tao Tai to recover his strength first, or would Ning Ke first comprehend the Haoran sword style and wake up from the muddled state? Ning Ke did not know that the situation was so dangerous. He did not know what kind of sacrifice and effort the calligraphy addict and Tao addict had made in order to prevent Lotus from interrupting his inexplicable state of cultivation. He did not know what he was doing. He did not know why he felt close to the sword marks and flames. His body and even the aura in his body subconsciously followed the direction of the sword marks. He even forgot everything that had happened previously and the world outside of himself. This state was very dangerous. It was like a naked baby walking in the dangerous wilderness without any weapons, and could be injured and eaten by wild beasts at any time. But it was also because this state was full of innocence and innocence, clean and transparent, without a speck of dust, that it could sincerely accept the projection of the outside world on its mind. This state was called emptiness. Ning Ke felt very good and powerful in the emptiness state. In front of him was only the stone wall, the roof, and the four walls of the green stone wall. The mottled sword marks on the stone wall seemed to have come to life, entering his soul through his eyes and evolving into countless things. Like the stars moving in the night sky, like the stream jumping in the valley, like the clouds floating in the blue sky, like the mountain standing proudly in the world, like a traveler walking happily on the road. Those sword marks started to flow, forming traces, like a book gradually turning its pages. On each page, there were clear diagrams. Those diagrams seemed to be some kind of magical footwork, some kind of powerful sword technique, and some kind of magical cultivation technique. But at the same time, they were nothing, just some kind of meaning, some kind of attitude. He followed the sword mark in his eyes and began to imitate walking. He began to wield the knife like a sword, began to think silently, and began to savor it with a smile. His steps became smoother and smoother, and the pedao he held became more and more fluid. Vaguely, he comprehended something on a deeper level. The sword marks that youngest martial uncle left on the bluestone wall were actually just to express some kind of emotion. His steps became smoother and smoother, and his saber swings became smoother and smoother. In the end, he felt carefree. If a traveler wanted to see more of the world and forget the fatigue and pain of the journey, he should dance and sing as he walked. The mountains stood alone in the world, and had to ignore the worship of the common people to be free, so they should be proud and awe-inspiring. The clouds stopped or floated in the blue sky because they were following the direction of the wind. The stream flowed down the valley, and had to treat every collision with the stone as a game. It rushed down briskly with the attraction of the earth, creating countless beautiful splashes. This was called jumping. The stars in the night sky were either still or moving, and just smiled at the world according to their own thoughts. Everything was as it should be. This was a carefree feeling that was called as it should be. Because it should be, even if thousands of people were in front of me, I would go when I wanted to. I had a great spirit, so I should be free to go. This was the truth between the heaven and the earth. In his badly damaged sense of perception, the psyche power that he had obtained from meditation for more than 10 years began to flow slowly like the clouds, the stars, and the stream. It began to be as still as a mountain, and began to be as cheerful as a traveler. The sword style contained in the mottled sword marks on the stone wall floated along with the faint phosphorescence and gradually penetrated into his body. As his mind was enlightened, the sword style sped up and then began to flow with the psyche power, stopping and jumping. He did not know what kind of existence these sword styles were. After entering his body, they turned into a warm flow and repaired his sense of perception in a very short time. Then they continued to pierce his snow mountain and ocean of chi from between his eyebrows. The feeling of his sense of perception being repaired and moisturized was very good. Ning Kai stood in front of the stone wall with the knife in his hand, unaware of everything outside. But his eyebrows unconsciously stretched, and then suddenly tightened, feeling a very strong pain in his chest and abdomen. The sword style and the mottled sword marks raged in his body, as if it had turned into thousands of real small swords rampaging, cutting the meridians and viscera invisible to the naked eye until they were dripping with blood and poking thousands of holes. This was more terrifying than the Tao addict's tens of thousands of Taoist swords by the Daming Lake. Then the thousands of small swords flew to the snow mountain in his waist and abdomen, and began to hit it constantly. The sharp edges easily cut off the hard ice between the snow-capped peak, and countless snowflakes burst out. The speed of the sword style hitting the snow mountain was getting faster and faster, and in the blink of an eye, it had completed millions of cuts. The cutting of the swords and the ice gradually accumulated a terrible high temperature, and the snow mountain, which had been frozen for countless years, began to melt into water and converged upward into the ocean of chi. Thousands of small swords flew up again in his body or consciousness, and flew to the calm ocean of chi. Still like hitting the snow mountain, they began to silently and attentively cut hundreds of millions of times. The calm ocean of chi began to roll, stirring up huge waves, as if it was boiling, and finally it began to boil into a mist that covered the sky. The snow mountain and ocean of Qi melted and evaporated into mist, and slowly moved forward in his body according to some kind of channel. Every time it met a certain place, some mist would be left behind, and then condensed into dew and began to moisten it. With the constant moistening of the dew condensed by the mist, those body parts began to decompose and reconstruct, just like an old house being dismantled and then rebuilt. But the rebuilt house was so beautiful, so strong, and supported by the pillars, that it was not afraid of rain and wind at all. Ning Ke felt that as the warmth flowed through his body, there seemed to be innumerable strength repouring into his muscles and bones. This feeling was very comfortable, good, and powerful, and intoxicating and unwilling to wake up. The sword marks on the mottled stone walls were still moving slowly, and the sword style in the deep sword marks was still entering his body, turning into countless small swords that kept bombarding the snow mountain and ocean of Qi, nourishing and strengthening his body. Time passed minute by minute. Ning Ke, who was in pain and intoxication, suddenly felt a shadow in his heart. Even though he was in a state of emptiness, he felt that his body had become cold, because he suddenly thought of something and began to have a great fear. If he allowed this majestic sword style to continue, wouldn't his snow mountain and ocean of Qi be pierced through? If the Qi openings that he had painstakingly opened disappeared, would he still be able to cultivate? Because of fear, because of uneasiness, he suddenly woke up. He looked at the mottled sword marks on the wall uneasily. He was covered in cold sweat, and the place between his palm and the hilt of the sword was cold and slippery. These sword marks, these sword styles, were youngest uncle's Haoran sword. He finally understood what Master Lotus meant by that. Cultivating the Haoran sword depended on the Great Spirit in one's chest. In order to cultivate the Great Spirit, one had to betray Haotian, and even become enemies with Haotian. To be enemies with Haotian, one would be a devil. And the moment youngest uncle held this sword, he had already become a devil. That was why youngest uncle was finally punished by heaven and died. He had already understood the Haoran sword style, and if he accepted the sword style into his body as Qi, he would inherit youngest uncle's legacy. And he would become a devil. Continuing youngest uncle's legacy was an honorable and proud thing. However, it was also the most dangerous thing in the world. Even a peerless figure like youngest uncle could not escape the fate of being destroyed once he became a devil. If he learned the Haoran sword, how many more days could he live in this world? Ning Ke looked around in confusion. In the Bone Mountain, the old monk was silently cultivating the devil's skill. Yi Hongyu was unconscious under him. Seeing that he had finally woken up, Mo Shanshan smiled with difficulty. She could no longer support her body and fainted on the ground. Night had already covered the world outside the mountain, and the room was extremely dark. He stood in front of the Bone Mountain with his sword. His clothes were drenched in cold sweat, and he did not know how to move forward. The sword marks on the mottled stone wall stopped flowing, and he waited silently. The sword style in his body stopped flowing, and he waited silently. His will was also waiting silently for the final decision. Once he became a devil, even someone like Lotus could only hide in the dark. If he wanted to walk proudly in the world like youngest uncle, no matter what state he cultivated to, he would still be punished by heaven and die. Ning Ke looked up at the sky, but he could not see anything. He could only see the cold stone wall and the color of the night. For a cultivator, this was the most difficult decision. Their reverence for Haotian would make them not dare to touch that dark world. Even cultivators who did not have the slightest reverence for Haotian would struggle due to the terrifying consideration of life and death. They would probably think hard for half their lives and still not come to a final conclusion. It seemed that he had been thinking and struggling for a lifetime. In fact, he had only thought for a short time when 30 green onions fell from his small palm onto the fried egg noodles. He wanted to live. He wanted to live with someone. That was the most important thing. Compared to him, Haotian was just a pile of shit. Shit. Ning Ke raised his padao until it was level with his eyebrows. This was the last time he prayed to heaven. Then the padao fell. The blade fell on the stone wall. It fell on the sword marks left by youngest uncle. He turned his wrist and moved the blade. Following the two sword marks, he moved to the left and then to the right. Phosphorescence danced under the blade, like stars leaving the night sky. With this simple action, the sword style that had been waiting silently suddenly rose. Countless small swords condensed together and came down from the ocean of Qi, splitting the snow mountain. At this moment, Ning Ke knew that he had entered a new world. The psyche power in his sense of perception was still there, but it was no longer playing the zither to the heaven and earth. Instead, it created a beautiful new world in his body. There were trees, lakes, mountains and seas in that world, waiting for life to flourish here. There was an additional passage between the snow mountain and the ocean of Qi. It seemed that the passage had always existed, but it was blocked and could not be seen. At this moment, it finally showed its true appearance. The majestic sword style turned into some kind of substantial aura and whistled through the passage. It was vast and boundless, rushing straight into the sky. It was so fast. It was the Great Spirit. A slight sound of airflow was heard. Dust and debris splashed out from Ning Ke's body. His eyes were crystal clear, and then they slowly became normal. The second chapter, there is still an ending to this big plot. But these are all the drafts. They will all be released today. I am happy and sad at the same time. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 283. By the Hulun Sea, the cold snow covered the yellow grass, and the lake gradually froze. The grassland man was seizing the last moment to catch fish. The middle-aged man wearing the felt hat looked at the scene on the lake in silence. A pale beard gradually grew on his square and stiff cheeks, making him look even more valiant. A subordinate stood behind him with a respectful expression. The caravan from the Central Plains had been here for quite some time. The tribe's headman did not know what they were waiting for. If they were waiting for the furs to be delivered at the end of summer, it would be a little too early. But seeing that the caravan had given them enough money and goods, no one paid any attention to them. The subordinate looked at the ice and snow on the lake and whispered hesitantly, "Will the tomes of Arcane really appear here?" After a moment of silence, the middle-aged man said, "When the great divine priest of Revelation returned from the south, he released the news that the tomes of Arcane appeared in the wilderness. He must have received confirmation from the Abbey Dean. I heard that Li Qingshan and Huang Yang once calculated in the Wanyan Tower that the tomes of Arcane would appear by the Hulun Sea. It should not be wrong." The subordinate frowned and said after a moment of thought, "Your Excellency, I should not have questioned it. I just feel that it is a little risky to pin all our hopes on the edict issued by the great divine priest of Revelation." After a pause, he said softly, "We can't keep the news from Tiang City. If the imperial court knows that you left the general's mansion without permission, and a few days ago, there was confirmation that Lin Ling was indeed dead." The middle-aged man looked at the strategist who had been loyal to him for the past 20 years and thought of his equally loyal subordinate who was already dead. He stroked the hair on his temples and said slowly, "We'll deal with those things in the future. The current situation is complicated. We can only break out of this predicament by obtaining the tomes of Arcane. Compared to that, everything else is irrelevant." He looked at the vast mountains in the north across the lake and said expressionlessly, "I believe the great divine priest of Revelation because there are few people in the world who know that the passage out of the front gate is at the Hulun Sea." The counselor frowned and asked, "Why not enter the front gate to find the tomes of Arcane? Even if many forces are paying attention, there are very few people who have the ability to enter the front gate. It is better to wait for the opportunity than to wait passively." The middle-aged man looked at the distant north in silence and did not answer the question. Mr. Ku did not take the tomes of arcane away, so the tomes of arcane should still be in the sacred ground. He didn't want to return to the mountain gate. Instead, he waited silently by the lake for an opportunity to snatch it. Apart from strategic considerations, it was mostly because of the fear in his heart. At that time, he wasn't very old, but he could already clearly remember those bloody scenes, as well as that ruthless teacher who had a myriad of incarnations. The counselor looked at the middle-aged man's thoughtful expression and thought silently, "I wonder what His Excellency will do after obtaining the tomes of arcane. Will he offer it to His Majesty, the Divine Hall, or keep it for himself? Could a scroll of the heavenly book really change everything?" Over the past 20 years, the strategist had followed his lord to struggle for survival. He seemed to have woven an extremely dense net, but in the end, this net had bound him, gradually making it difficult for him to breathe. When he thought of this, he could not help but sigh sadly in his heart. The middle-aged man calmly gazed into the distance on the other side of the lake, once again thinking of his deceased teacher. All these years, he, who was born in the Enlightenment doctrine, had struggled to survive between the Empire and the West Hill Divine Palace in order to protect himself and his sister who was hidden in the Chang, an imperial palace. Back then, his teacher had traveled among the various forces in the world, but he was like a fish swimming in the lake. He was extremely comfortable and even exuded a sense of happiness. How did he do it? Rough fingers slowly stroked the stone platform, and the animal skin gently trembled in the wind. Standing in front of the bottomless abyss, Tang looked at the giant horizontal stone beams in front of him. He recalled the appearance of the Holy Land that his teacher had described in the past. It corresponded with the increasingly desolate world in front of him because of its grandeur. He was silent for a long time. He slowly walked to the edge of the cliff and looked at the endless dark abyss. He silently thought that Haotian Taoism had its reasons for being able to lead the Central Plains for 1,000 years. It should not be underestimated, especially since the Taoist of the Jishou Abbey must really have the ability to fight against the heavens. Since they placed so much importance on this matter, the tomes of the heavenly book must have been left in the front gate. But why hadn't they found it? He looked at the hall full of white bones not far away from his feet and suddenly said, according to the teacher, when Mr. Ko broke into the Holy Land with his sword, he did not kill everyone in the front gate. Before the teacher left, he confirmed that many of the disciples had also left. Other than the seniors who died in the battle, many of these white bones were people who committed suicide and then the front gate was sealed. Tang Xiaotang opened her bright eyes and looked at the hall under the stone beam. She had already passed by that place, but she did not find anything. She curiously asked, "Where did those guys go?" A gust of wind swept past the stone beam, blowing up bits of gravel and clothes. Tang felt the aura of heaven and earth in the front gate in the wind. After a moment of silence, he calmly said, "I can't feel it. They should have left." After saying this, the brother and sister walked into the depths of the front gate. Tang's thick eyebrows slowly furrowed. There were many things that he could not see through in the past. There were also many things that he could not see through in this search for the tomes of the heavenly book. For example, he was sure that those people had left the front gate, but why did he still feel a little uneasy? Decades ago, Kuharan had personally set up the confinement and directly turned this room into a world that was isolated from the rest of the world. As long as one did not step in personally, one would be able to discover the existence of this world. But if one really stepped into this world, one would never be able to walk out again. This was because this world was the hell that he had personally given to Lotus. Huh. Woo-woo. You actually learned the Haoran sword. In the middle of the room, on the mountain of white bones, Master Lotus looked at Ning Ke and opened his toothless mouth to laugh like a child. Then, his lips pursed and he began to cry like a child. His laughter and crying mixed together and it was extremely hoarse and unpleasant. Ning Ke held the padao and looked at him as he replied, yes. The old monk's gaze was as cold as ghost fire. He stared at his face and said faintly, this can't happen. Ning Ke said, it just happened. The old monk's next sentence came extremely quickly. He shouted like thunder, then aren't you being possessed by the devil? Ning Ke's face was still expressionless as he replied calmly, yes. The old monk asked sternly, aren't you afraid? Ning Ke replied, in the face of death, I am not afraid of anything else. The old monk said mockingly, but you are still possessed by the devil. Ning Ke frowned and said, so? The old monk screamed sternly, those who are possessed by the devil must die. Ning Ke said, but you are still alive. The old monk shook his head slowly and said with slight mockery, these are two completely different choices. In fact, the Enlightenment doctrine is just a moss-covered stone that hides in the dark to avoid Haotian's divine light. Even though we say that we do not respect Haotian, we are actually extremely afraid of Haotian's existence. That is why Haotian allows us to exist, even as a contrast to the light. However, when you pick up the sword left behind by that person, you will lose all respect and even fear Haotian. This is the true devil's path. Haotian will not allow people like you to exist. Ning Ke was silent for a moment before he replied, as long as I am alive, it is better than being dead. The snow-capped peak reflected the starlight under the night sky. As the chi of heaven and earth rapidly poured into the front gate, it drove the stagnant aura between the stones and even caused the starlight to flow. The fresh aura of heaven and earth that was full of vitality finally passed through the broken confinement and came to the hall that had not been here for decades. Then, it poured into the old monk's skinny body like a flood. The old monk's sunken eyes suddenly shone brightly and turned into a crystal. His skinny cheeks magically became plump at a speed visible to the naked eye. His two arms that were stretched out in the wind became smooth and firm. Just like what he said before, his time was up. So was Ning Ke's time. He had completely understood the Haoran sword chi that youngest uncle had passed to him. He could already control his transformed body and began to greedily and forcefully absorb the aura of heaven and earth that rushed into the room. Then, he turned it into his own power, absorbing the chi of heaven and earth into his body. This was the most obvious and most unacceptable feature of the devil's doctrine. After the fresh and inexhaustible aura of heaven and earth entered his body, it was branded by psyche power. Then, it passed through the passage between the snow mountain and the ocean of chi and turned into a majestic power. It passed through the meridians to every part of his body. His arms, muscles, bones, fingertips, and even his hair began to tremble at a high frequency, as if they were jumping for joy because they were powerful. The sole of his foot landed. With a crisp sound, he crushed a white bone in front of him. The second time he landed, his foot had crushed a large pile of white bones. Ning Ke skimmed to the mountain of bones and came to the front of the old monk. He held the knife with both hands and stabbed it into the old monk's chest. The blade of the knife vibrated at a high speed due to the strong power coming from the hilt. It cut and shook the surrounding air, causing wisps of white turbulence. The cold talisman on the surface of the knife was activated, but it was even more terrifying than the speed of the knife itself. This was the fastest attack he had ever made in his life. It was as fast as lightning. This was the strongest attack he had ever made in his life. It was as fast as thunder. The electric knife that carried the Great Spirit did not allow for the blink of an eye or even the time to think before it violently reached the old monk's chest. The sharp tip of the knife pierced into the old monk's chest before he could react. At this moment, Master Lotus was absorbing the chi of heaven and earth non-stop. His cheeks were plump and his arms had recovered. His body was full of vitality like a newly bloomed lotus. However, he did not expect Ning Ke's first strike to be so overwhelming and unstoppable. At this moment, he had recovered about 10% of his state power from his peak. He was once Lotus 32, who had thousands of incarnations and looked down on the common people. Even if he had only recovered 10% of his power, he would not be killed by such a strike. His skinny ghostly hands had become plump again. His skin was white and smooth, like two pure white lotus flowers. The white lotus flowers bloomed and its petals bloomed. The blade stopped between the petals and could not go any further into the old monk's heart. At this moment, the aura of heaven and earth that had broken through the confinement was still surging into the old monk's body. He was still growing stronger. Ning Ke groaned and his left hand slapped the end of the hilt heavily. At this moment, his left hand was like a heavy hammer. The padao went further into the old monk's chest. The tip of the blade started to ooze blood. The old monk looked at Ning Ke coldly. A terrifyingly strong psychic power pierced his sense of perception. With a puff, Ning Ke spat out a mouthful of blood. The blood dripped onto the hilt of the knife. His left hand landed on the hilt again. He endured the intense pain and his left hand turned into a hammer again, hitting the end of the hilt heavily. The blade went another inch deeper into the old monk's chest. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 284. The old monk let out a shrill scream. His hands, which were like white lotuses holding onto the blade, started to tremble rapidly. A substantial force surged up along the blade and collided with the Haoran sword that Ning Ke had infused into the blade. There was a loud bang. Dust flew up in the dark devil's hull. The bone mountain collapsed and the broken bones and bone fragments were like garbage. They were blown around by the strong wind and hit the bluestone walls. The unconscious Mo Shanshan and Yi Hongyu were also pushed to the corner by the strong impact. The chi of heaven and earth, which had not appeared for decades, continued to repair Master Lotus's broken body. It helped him to recover his state and strength at a terrifying speed. The first thing that became terrifyingly strong was his mental strength. The chi of heaven and earth was also absorbed by Ning Ke at the same time. It was then converted into the primordial chi in his body and finally turned into a powerful force that he had never experienced before. In the end, it was still a competition of time. It all depended on whether Ning Ke could become strong enough to kill his opponent before the old monk recovered. That was why Ning Ke did not use the talisman in the pouch or the primordial 13 arrows. This was because these techniques required the chi of heaven and earth to reach a certain strength. It also required his psyche power to be completely unaffected by his opponent's mental strength. Under such circumstances, he could only trust the three padaos behind him. The three padaos that had killed countless enemies from Min Mountain to the city of Wei and from the city of Wei to the Spring Breeze Pavilion. However, it was a pity that absorbing the chi of heaven and earth was a technique of the Devil's Doctrine. As a veteran of the Devil's Doctrine, Master Lotus was far more skilled in this technique and state than Ning Quebec. The difference in state between the two of them was too great. Time was not fair. Ning Ke could not kill his opponent with one strike. As time passed slowly and unstoppably, the situation became more and more disadvantageous for him. He could clearly feel that his body was stronger than before. However, the hand that was holding onto the hilt of the padao started to tremble weakly. He could barely hold onto the hilt anymore. This was because the power coming from the blade was almost stronger than his. He looked up and saw the cold eyes of the old monk. When their gazes met, it did not produce a destructive effect like when their auras met on the blade. Instead, it was gentle and tranquil, like a drop of dew rolling off a lotus leaf and landing on the surface of a lake, causing ripples. When the ripples spread, it was a new world. Master Lotus' pitiful voice came from the night sky. This is my world. Ning Ke looked at the billions of stars embedded in the night sky and remained silent. He knew that his sense of perception had finally been invaded by the old monk's terrifying spiritual power once again. He also finally understood that the space 1 foot in front of a truly powerful cultivator was definitely their world. Be it their power or consciousness, everything would be under their control. The night sky suddenly shook. It did not crack, but the billions of stars embedded in it fell. Those stars cut through the sky and smashed into the wilderness in front of him with long tails. The earth groaned and trembled painfully. The winter trees and frost grass were covered by the splashed mud or burned to ashes by the high temperature. He knew what this scene represented. The billions of stars that fell from the night sky were Master Lotus's spiritual power. The moaning and groaning wasteland, grass, and trees were his sea of consciousness. When the wilderness and the grass and trees were turned into a purgatory by the falling stars and turned into scorched earth, his sea of consciousness would be broken and he would either die or become an ignorant cripple. Ning Kai stood in the wilderness and looked at the wildfire caused by the falling stars. He looked at the horrifying crater in the wilderness nearby. He did not brush off the black mud on his body, nor did he hide, because he did not know how to avoid it. He had just inherited youngest uncle's legacy and risked being punished by heaven. He saw that he could survive in the midst of death, but he ended up in such a hopeless situation and was about to die. Was this really fate? Was it really Haotian's curse? His heart was cold and he even felt true despair. However, in the depths of his despair, there was still a strong unwillingness and a strong desire to shatter all these stars. It was as if an existence in the unseen world had sensed his strong unwillingness and desire. An extremely faint shadow slowly spread over his head and covered his entire body. He looked at the shadow in front of him and his own shadow that was even deeper in the shadow. He suddenly turned around. There was nothing in the wilderness behind him. There was only a statue. A black statue. The statue seemed to be a human, but also seemed to be a deity. As its back was facing the light, its face and body were immersed in the deep shadow and could not be seen clearly. The stars in the night sky were still falling. Hundreds of millions of stars kept hitting the wilderness and became denser and denser, gradually annihilating Ning Kai's body. After the appearance of this black statue, the falling stars were like moths that had seen a flame and were strongly attracted by an invisible force. They all swept toward the black statue. The stars that had caused such a huge commotion earlier were as weak as fireflies when they collided with the huge black statue. Hundreds of millions of stars were a group of weak fireflies. They kept hitting each other and flashed a weak flame. The weak flame was also absorbed by the black statue. The black statue gradually heated up and then turned red, as if it was plated with a layer of blood. It should be very hot, right? Ning Kai looked at the huge statue in confusion and thought so. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his waist. He looked down and saw that his belt was emitting wisps of green smoke, as if it was about to burn. He did not know what was inside, but it was extremely hot. Ning Kai returned to the real world. Only then did he realize that the old monk had pushed the blade out a few inches from his chest. The hard hilt was already at his waist, pressing against something in his belt. That thing was so hot that it seemed to be burning. It was maddening. Ning Kai stared at the old monk's warm but cold eyes. He held the hilt tightly and pushed it forward. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth like a waterfall. He roared in pain, his feet digging deep into the limestone floor like nails. He leaned forward and used the hard object at his waist to hold the hilt of the saber. He put all his weight on it, and the edge of the saber went in another inch. The old monk looked at the blade that was slowly entering his chest and his eyes were filled with disbelief. His mental strength touched Ning Kai's body and disappeared instantly, like a clay ox entering the sea. The speed of the loss was shocking. In just a moment, his sense of perception was half empty. Using the devil's skill to absorb the chi of heaven and earth relied on pure psyche power to control it. At this time, the psyche power in his sense of perception was drying up. The chi of heaven and earth in the devil's hall did not enter his body but floated towards Ning Kei's body. The old monk could clearly feel that the power from the blade in his hands had suddenly increased. He glared at Ning Kei, and then looked down at his waist. There was an extremely soft sound of friction. It was like the gentle breeze from a lake brushing across the lotus leaves. The sharp blade cut off a few fingers and the broken fingers fell slowly. The pure white lotus petals fell off. Ning Kei let out a muffled groan. The padao in his hand violently pierced forward, accompanied by an unstoppable Haoran sword style. The bright blade pierced into the old monk's chest with a puff, directly piercing through his heart. Chapter 4, to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 285. No matter how strong a cultivator was, if his heart was pierced, he should be dead, right? Ning Kei was still extremely vigilant. This was because the old monk's state and strength had exceeded all his battle experience. He did not know what kind of survival ability the other party, who had already surpassed the 5 states, had. That was why he did not pull out his knife. Instead, he stared at the old monk's eyes that were inches away from him, looking at the life in the deepest part of his old eyes. With a forceful twist of his wrist, the cold blade directly shattered the old monk's heart into pieces. The old monk's body suddenly convulsed. He clutched his chest in pain, but did not die immediately. Ning Kei frowned and prepared to pull out his padao to chop off the person's head. The old monk stared at Ning Kei's waist and suddenly laughed maniacally. His laughter was maniacal, but his laughter was very weak. In the end, it turned into a sobbing sound. He panted and said, "I see. Is this fate?" This old peerless powerhouse finally understood something from Ning Kei at the moment of his death. He murmured, "I was born a devil. I will die a devil. I thought I could jump out of the 3 realms. But I did not expect that when I finally die, I will know that my life will always be in this mountain." Ning Kei did not care about what the old monk was saying. He was not an artistic youth and did not have the hobby of listening to the last words of a strong enemy. He only wanted to kill the other party completely and end this nightmarish encounter. However, when he wanted to pull out his padao, he realized that the old monk's body seemed to have turned into a swamp. The sharp and smooth blade was tightly stuck in his chest. Fortunately, there was no powerful force coming from the blade. His sense of perception did not suffer another mental attack. Since he could not pull out his knife, he would go deeper. Ning Kei grunted and exerted force again. The padao in his hands directly pierced through the old monk's body. The Haoran sword chi in his chest and abdomen flowed along the blade without hesitation. Shaken by the sword style, the old monk spat out a mouthful of blood. After being imprisoned here for decades, he could only drink water from the cracks of the bluestone rocks and eat white skeletal corpses. Although the old monk was a person who was able to abstain from eating, he was still tortured to the point that he did not look human. Perhaps because of the lack of water, the blood he spat out was black and extremely viscous. It was like the oil at the bottom of a stove that was used to seeing smoke and fire. The old monk slowly sat up straight, ignoring the Haoran sword style that was destroying all the vitality in his internal organs. He looked at Ning Kei's face in front of him and slowly spread his hands on his knees, forming the famous lotus mudra. Previously he was cut by the blade, and now he only had 4 fingers left on both of his hands. The white bones between the broken fingers were oozing with blood, looking extremely terrifying. However, as soon as the incomplete lotus seal appeared, a clear aura immediately enveloped his body. The gentle and compassionate feeling gradually spread out among the broken bones on the ground. In the west, there was a lotus that fell into the world. It had 32 petals, and each petal was different. Each petal was a world. Now, there were only 4 petals left. They belonged to the same world, yet it was peaceful because of this. Since it could not jump out of the 3 realms, and since it was only in this mountain, then why did it have to create countless illusory worlds? If it wanted to surpass the 3 realms, why did it have to let the petals go with the wind? It would be more beautiful if it bloomed quietly in the mountain. Master Lotus quietly looked at Ning Kei's eyes. Then Ning Kei heard his voice. He was not controlled by Master Lotus's psyche power and was not forced to enter the world that was 1 foot in front of him. Instead, it was when 2 people's souls met in the psyche realm and they could feel each other's consciousness, or rather, their thoughts. The moment they met, Ning Kei could clearly tell that Master Lotus's heart was very calm. It was not joy, but a kind of enlightenment after a thorough understanding. This feeling even seemed to be a little intimate. Master Lotus's eyes were as warm as a spring lake as he quietly looked at Ning Quebec. What is it that I am pursuing? What is it that people of our generation are pursuing? Under the heavenly way, can there be a new world that is different from the past? I don't know, and I also don't know if Kuharan knew in the end. He looked at the mottled sword marks on the bluestone wall, and a trace of a smile appeared on his pale old face. In the end, you still won. Your successor won. But can he obtain the final victory? The devil's doctrine was destroyed because of you and me. Will it be revived in his hands? My revenge against you will probably start like this, but I don't know how it will end. Or should this be the beginning of my revenge against Haotian? Then, Master Lotus retracted his gaze and continued to look at Ning Kei's eyes. Ning Kei's mind buzzed. He felt that many things were transmitted from the old monk's crystal clear and calm gaze. Those things were not specific cultivation knowledge, nor were they images. They were just some vague feelings. You have already joined the devil. If you want to cultivate the devil's doctrine, you must first cultivate Buddhism. Then, please walk bravely into the darkness. Although you do not have much chance of success and might die the moment you start on your journey, I still wish you well, and curse you. Master Lotus looked at him quietly as he said his last words in this world. He slowly closed his eyes and spread his hands on his knees, like a white lotus withering. Ning Kei held the hilt of his knife tightly and looked in front of him in confusion. There seemed to be a slight sound as the wind blew past. The old monk's body that was hanging on the blade suddenly cracked like a weathered sand sculpture. It fell onto the messy bones on the ground and made a rustling sound. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, bones to bones. The young master of the Song Kingdom, Lian Sheng, came to this world with water lilies. When he was still an innocent baby, he had already joined the devil's doctrine. This was not something he could choose, because his family had always been a member of the devil's doctrine. After marriage, his beloved wife discovered this secret and was killed by his father. He built a hut beside the grave to guard it. Since they could not live together, he wanted to die together. Hence, he entered the grave late at night and prepared to die together. That night, it was raining and he meditated in front of the grave for half a night. Then, he put on his wet clothes and started to travel the world. He left his family and cultivated all the way. He showed his wonderful state in the Lank Temple and became famous. He wanted to destroy the devil's doctrine. However, when the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace invited him to join the devil's doctrine, he found himself close to the front gate of the devil's doctrine deep in the wilderness. It was only then that he realized that he was born to be a person here. Not a temple, not a temple, not a divine hall, not a Wa mountain, but a mountain abandoned by Haotian. He still wanted to destroy the devil's doctrine that was rotten and smelled like the mud at the bottom of the lotus pond. However, he realized that after destruction, he should be reborn. Hence, he wanted to create a new devil's doctrine and then create a new world. He had extraordinary talent and cultivated in Taoism, Buddhism and the devil's doctrine. He wanted to use the devil to cover the sky and Taoism to obey the heaven. Finally, he used Buddhism to reach the nirvana realm and jump out of the three realms. Only then could he erase the ruthless heaven's way of the old world and find something that he wanted to find through time. For this, he did not hesitate to do evil. Gradually, he did not know what evil was. He did many earth-shattering things and made a name for himself. He killed thousands of people. Then, he met a man named Kuharan. At that time, he had already arranged everything. He only needed to hide on the black jade throne in the Peach Mountain Divine Hall and wait patiently. He waited for Kuharan and the headmaster of the academy to die. Then, he would start to change the world. However, one day, he saw a woman beside Kuharan. The woman had a pure and charming smile on her face. She looked very much like his former wife. He smiled warmly like a friend and started ahead of time. He did not succeed. He was imprisoned in the netherworld for decades. He waited for hope in desperation. Then, the moment he saw hope, he died. Only when he saw death did he realize that he did not care about anything. Only then did he realize that he had been waiting for death. That rainy night, he did not have the courage to dig up the tomb. From then on, the world was a lonely tomb to him. He was a gravedigger who had gone mad. He was a person who had died long ago in the tomb. Ning Ke stood on the spot with a dazed expression. The padao in his hand slowly fell. Master Lotus died just like that. However, the fragments of consciousness that had been transmitted to his mind previously still existed. Those feelings were complicated and even chaotic, just like Master Lotus. The last sword style and the mottled sword marks on the bluestone wall was still flowing into his body. Together with the aura of heaven and earth, it slowly changed his body. His tattered cotton-padded jacket revealed the gray-white cotton and trembled slightly. Ning Ke wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He supported himself with his padao and walked to the corner of the wall with difficulty. After confirming that Mo Shanshan and Yi Hongyu were only unconscious and not dead, he finally felt relieved. According to his original way of doing things, he would definitely take the opportunity when the Tao addict was unconscious to kill her directly. However, looking at the horrible bite marks on her body, he did not know why he did not do it. Ning Ke sat against the wall and looked down at his chest. He began to cough violently. He felt the changes in his body and the consciousness that the old monk had passed to him. Fear and uneasiness gradually occupied his heart. If these things were known by others, what would the headmaster of academy and the academy do? Once he lost his biggest support, how could he survive in the world that was filled with Haotian's divine light? His body was on the verge of collapse due to the continuous heavy injuries. At this moment, he finally relaxed. The fear brought by his rationality and the intense pain from his injury struck him, making him anxious and unable to calm down. He did not even have time to think about how to leave the front gate of the devil's doctrine. He frowned in pain and did not know how to face the future of his life. With a stomach full of doubts and fear, Ning Ke leaned against the wall and fainted. The Haoran sword style on the mottled stone wall floated down and indifferently surrounded his unconscious body. The speed at which the aura of heaven and earth poured into him became extremely slow, but it continued. It seemed that as long as he was alive, it would continue like this forever. He joined the devil in the depths of the mountain that was abandoned by Haotian. At this moment, in the far north of the wilderness, the hot sea gradually froze and entered a long night. This time, when the night came, it seemed that it would never leave. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 286. While he was crossing the mountains, she was waiting quietly in Xiaofan. It was the same winter, but the coldness was different. Fortunately, the night was still fair. It covered the Tianqi Mountains and Xiaofan. In the Lin 47th Street in the middle of winter, the old brush pen shop welcomed another ordinary night. In the small courtyard, Sang sat on a small bench and looked at the white light on her fingertips. Her dark face was illuminated by the light and her willow eyes became brighter, as if she was missing something. The old man smiled at her with his hands in his sleeves. His cotton-padded jacket was much cleaner than before, and his gray hair was combed smoothly. He still looked ordinary, which made it hard to believe that he was the great divine priest of light from the West Hill Divine Palace. A few days ago, there had been a few snowfalls in Xiaofan. Tonight, the snow had stopped and the clouds had dispersed. The sky was clear and the dark night sky was dotted with thousands of stars, calmly watching the buildings on the ground and the people inside. The divine light gradually extinguished at her fingertips. Sang looked up at the stars in the sky and asked seriously, "Teacher, the divine skill can sense and control Haotian divine light. Haotian divine light is the sunlight, so why can starlight also work?" The old man took out his hands from the sleeves of his cotton-padded jacket and was ready to explain the true meaning of Haotian. Sang did not notice his action. She squinted at the night stars and frowned. She continued, "Are these stars in the sky countless suns? But they are too far away from us, so they look smaller and darker. That's why the aura we feel when we practice the divine skill is much lighter than during the day." The old man sighed with emotion. He thought that he had realized this after practicing the divine skill for 3 years, but his new disciple found it so early. He could not help but feel happy, proud, disappointed, and slightly sour. He said, "Logically speaking, it should be so. But I once saw the stars more than 10 years ago and felt that they were different from what I imagined." Sang stopped looking at the starry sky and looked at the old man's kind face. She asked seriously, "Teacher, cultivation is to control weapons to hit people by controlling the qi of heaven and earth. How should we practice the divine skill?" The old man shook his head with a smile. He wondered why his disciple was so obsessed with using divine skill to beat people. He said softly, "The Haotian divine light is the most tranquil and the origin of all the primordial qi in the world. But it is also the most violent because it can purify everything in the world into nothingness." A withered leaf floated to Sang's knee. She glanced at the snow marks left on the leaf and gently brushed it away. She looked at the old man and continued to ask seriously, "What does Haotian divine light rely on to purify everything in the world? Like burning firewood?" He didn't expect the little girl to use firewood cooking as a metaphor for the purification of the divine light. The old man couldn't help but laugh. Then, he explained seriously, "You can imagine the divine splendor as countless tiny particles. It is impossible to see the specific appearance of these tiny particles with the naked eye. These particles can emit light and possess almost infinite speed. However, once they travel at almost infinite speed, they will lose all their power. The spread of the power of the divine light is more like the ripples of a lake. The power contained in the waves is where its power lies. But your metaphor is right. Only when the particles in the divine light begin to vibrate violently and produce a high temperature that cannot be seen in the world will it show its unique power of purifying everything in the world." The old man looked at Sang's little face, paused for a moment, and said seriously, "The divine skill is a very powerful ability. However, the greater the ability, the greater the responsibility. Anyone who wants to have this ability must have the corresponding moral character. He must have a pure and transparent heart without a trace of darkness. Only in this way will he not be devoured by the divine skill." In his eyes, Sang was clean and transparent from her hair to her toes. It was because of this that he had been wandering around the 47th Street for so many days as if he had found a treasure. He thought that she was the lucky chance that Haotian had given him. At this time, the old man talked about the divine skill in such a serious manner because he was worried that if he left this world in the future, this female disciple would be blinded by the darkness of the world and her heart would be clouded by dust. She would no longer be transparent. There was a well in the courtyard, and the bucket beside the well was filled with freshly picked up water. The starlight seeped in but could not stay. Sang Sang shook her head and said, "Transparency has no color. But whether it is darkness or light, they are all colors." The old man was silent. He slowly thought about the female disciple's words and felt that they were very reasonable. Vaguely, he found that this statement was correct. He sighed with emotion and thought that perhaps only a truly transparent person could understand this point. Sang Sang continued seriously, "Young master used to teach me that power is power. It has no attribute like good or evil. Don't believe in any words about innate good or evil." The old man looked into her eyes and found that there was no doubt in her eyes, only certainty and natural belief. His expression changed slightly, and he thought that the young master seemed to be an interesting person. These days in the old brush pen shop, he heard countless nonsense or epigrams left by the young master through Sang Sang. He was a little curious about how the young master could develop such a realistic and certain idea, and he was also a little emotional about the young master's luck that Sang Sang could trust and rely on him so unreasonably. "Since you are more interested in the power of the divine skill, let's have a try." The old man smiled and stretched out his index finger. A ball of sacred white flame appeared on his fingertip. There was no temperature in the holy white flame, but the next moment the courtyard was shrouded in a dry and burning atmosphere, and the temperature in the flame began to spread. "The first thing we need to do is to perceive and condense the Haotian divine light between heaven and earth, and then with reverence ask the divine light to spread its heat and power outside the light." The ball of white flame floated down from the old man's fingertip and fell on the winter leaf that Sang Sang had brushed off her knee. With a soft sound, the residual snow on the winter leaf and the leaf itself disappeared instantly, not even a trace of smoke was left. Looking at this scene, Sang Sang lowered her head and thought quietly for a moment. Then, she raised her head and imitated the old man. She stretched out her index finger, and a round and lovely flame appeared on her fingertip. The flame contained a terrifying heat. The old man looked at the flame on her fingertip. Although he had felt too much shock from this little female disciple these days, his old eyes still couldn't suppress the expression of amazement and joy. She could condense Haotian divine light with one look and use Haotian divine light with another look. The old man was praised as the most outstanding great divine priest of light after the legendary figure 1,000 years ago. He was the person closest to Haotian in the world. However, he was very clear that he could not do this, and neither could the person 1,000 years ago. Sang Sang looked at the flame on her fingertip and hesitated. It seemed that she did not know how to deal with it. She looked at the kitchen, at the firewood under the stove and the pot of water on the stove. She thought that she had prepared to boil water. Suddenly, her willowy eyes brightened. She gently flicked the flame on her fingertip into the eye of the stove. The round flame floated into the stove and gently landed on the dry wood. With a light sizzling sound, the dry wood was instantly ignited and began to burn fiercely. In just a moment, the water in the pot began to emit wisps of steam. The flame that floated into the eye of the stove did not burn the firewood into smoke, which showed that the divine light condensed by Sang Sang was far from that of a real powerhouse of divine path in terms of purity and power. However, there was no frustration on her face. Chapter 287. The old brush pen shop did not keep idlers, except for Ning Quebec Sang took in the old man and even persuaded him to start cultivating the divine skill. She sincerely called him her teacher. But thinking of the old man's cowardly appearance before they met, she arranged a lot of housework for him, so that he would not become the kind of old man who carried a teapot and walked around in the street, basking in the sun and picking his teeth, pretending to be pitiful and scolding his daughter-in-law. The old man was not used to it at first. Since he left the small Taoist temple in the kingdom of Song decades ago, he had never done such chores as washing dishes and wiping tables. Whether he was sitting on the throne or being imprisoned in the secluded prison behind the Peach Mountain, there were countless people serving him. As the great god above the clouds, when had his hands ever been stained with water? But now he had to learn these things, because it was Songsong's request. He was Songsong's teacher, and he also thought that a successor should learn to respect his teacher. But he was very clear that if he did not listen to this little girl, he might no longer be her teacher at any time, which was absolutely unacceptable to him. Therefore, the most outstanding great divine priest of light in hundreds of years, who proudly betrayed the divine hall and single-handedly broke the confinement array set by the great divine priest of judgment, fell into the cage of life in front of Sang. If the world's devout followers of Haotian Taoism knew what happened to the old man now, that he was doing chores in a shabby alley in Chang'an City, they would probably faint with grief and indignation. No matter how incredible it was, once it was done many times, people would get used to it and even start to enjoy it. It seemed that the great divine priest of light could not escape this natural cycle. The old man rolled up his cotton sleeves and stood by the stove, holding a loofah pulp in his hand and carefully washing the dishes. Because his movements were getting more and more skilled, and it seemed that he would not break the dishes today, he subconsciously became happy, and a childlike expression appeared on his face. After finishing the housework arranged by Sang, the old man walked back to the front berth and put two square tables together to make a temporary bed. He took out a quilt from the corner behind the display shelf and laid it on the bed. He blew out the oil lamp and lay down to sleep. The starlight of the winter night shone on Lin 47th Street through the lattice on the shop door. The old man looked at the frost-like starlight on the ground, pressed the corner of the quilt tightly, and let out a comfortable sigh. He was very satisfied with his decision to leave Peach Mountain, very satisfied with his decision to come to Chang'an, very satisfied with his current life. Therefore, he forgot why he left Peach Mountain, why he came to Chang'an, and even rarely thought of the Black Shadow. Perhaps he subconsciously wanted to extend his life a little longer. To be able to find a successor was a happy thing, and to be able to find a successor like Sang was an indescribable happiness. The old man believed that there had never been such a person in Haotian Taoism in the past 1,000 years, and there probably wouldn't be another one in the next 1,000 years. Sang would definitely inherit his mantle and go further than him. She would eventually see the magical world that he had once glanced at with infatuation. The old man felt that he was not far from death. However, before he died, he could already see the future after death, and it was a bright and beautiful future that made him exclaim in admiration. How could he not be happy? Sang, who was in the house behind the shop, was also ready to sleep. She filled a bucket of remaining hot water and began to warm her feet. She kicked the water gently with her smooth and delicate feet, like a duckling playing in the pond. A 14-year-old girl living alone took in an old man of unknown origin, and the old man had been peeping outside the old brush pen shop for many days. It didn't seem right, but Sang did it. This didn't mean that Sang was a kind and gullible person. She might be kind, but she had been following Ning Ke around in this world for so many years, so she knew how sinister people could be. The reason why she took in the old man was that she saw the holy light exuding from the old man's fingertips, and then she confirmed that she could help Ning Ke fight after learning the divine skill. This reason was very important. In the past 10 years, it was Ning Ke who fought and killed for her, and she could only hide under the big black umbrella, occasionally shouting. Now that she had become a big girl, she should be able to do more things, such as helping Ning Ke fight and kill when necessary. After getting along with the old man for a long time, Sang Sang even developed a sense of closeness like family, because she could feel who was really good to her. She found that the old man treated her just a little less well than Ning Quebec. I don't know what young master is doing now. It's cold in the wilderness, isn't it? Sang Sang opened her eyes and looked at the roof, her little hand on the slightly cold brick bed, imagining Ning Ke's life in the wilderness. This was the longest time she had been separated from Ning Ke, and she couldn't get used to it. Because Ning Ke was not at home, she felt that there was no need to warm the newly built brick bed in the north of the house, so she habitually began to be thrifty. These days, the amount of silver charcoal under the brick bed was pitifully small, and the surface of the brick bed was somewhat refreshing. She took out the talismans left by Ning Ke from the cabinet and carefully stuck them on the outside of her underwear. Logically speaking, except for Ning Ke, no one else could stimulate the heat in these failed fire talismans, and he obviously forgot about it. But for some reason, perhaps because she began to cultivate the divine skill, her little body gradually warmed up. The winter of the 14th year of the Tianqi era came earlier and colder than usual. Sang Sang raised her little hand to her mouth and gently breathed out 2 hot breaths. Looking at the mist in her eyelashes, she thought of something. After a moment of hesitation, she took out Ning Ke's bedding from the big cabinet, opened the door and walked into the front bed, and gently covered the old man with it. A warm bed was the most insidious enemy of getting up. So the old man woke up late the next day. Looking at the bright sky outside the shop, he was shocked to think that he had forgotten to line up to buy the hot and sour noodle slice soup. When he hurriedly got up to wash up, he saw a piece of paper pressed down by a stone on the small stool by the well. On the paper was Sang Sang's young but beautiful handwriting. I just remembered that a sister asked me to go to her house for dinner at night. She will probably be there all day. Teacher, you don't have to wait for me to eat. If you get up late and can't buy the noodle slice soup, you can go to the shop next door to eat. I told Aunt Wu. The snow on the black tiles of the South School Abbey of Hautian Taoism was quietly looking at the red palace wall not far away in the morning light. Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, coughed slightly and looked at the files on the table. He frowned slightly. The official of the Imperial Center Administration who came to report bowed and said seriously, Mr. 13 has left the palace and must have entered Tianqi Mountain. I don't know if he can find the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. As for the tomes of Arcane. Nation Master, if the Imperial Court does not send masters there, I'm afraid it will be difficult to get it in front of the Divine Hall. Li Qingshan shook his head and said after a moment of silence, when His Majesty sent Ning Ke to the wilderness, the Imperial Court did not know about the tomes of Arcane. Later, they decided to let him have a try. It has nothing to do with the Imperial Court or the South School or the Imperial Center Administration. This is the idea of Mr. Second of the Academy, so it is the Academy's business. You don't have to think too much. There was no need to think too much, because it was meaningless to think too much. The tomes of Arcane in the wilderness was enough to attract the attention of too many forces, especially the West Hill Divine Palace. It was obvious that they had made sufficient preparations for this. Although the intelligence said that the Hierarch Lord and 3 great divine priests were still in Peach Mountain, who knew whether people from the Abbey would go there or not? Facing such a situation, the Tang Empire could only defeat the Divine Hall and get the tomes of Arcane if they launched an all-out attack. However, it was obvious that the Imperial Court would not do this. The Academy was the right way to go. However, Li Qingshan also did not understand why the Academy would put all their hopes on Ning Quebec. After all, that guy's state was really terrible. Li Qingshan did not spend too much time and energy on this matter. He began to read other files sent by the Imperial Center Administration. Now he was completely focused on searching for the traces of the great divine priest of light. The headmaster of academy was traveling far away, but there was such a powerful and terrible great divine priest lurking in Chang'an city. Both His Majesty and himself would feel very uneasy. The ambush in the late general's mansion ended in failure. Although the empire did not suffer any loss, the South School of Haotian Taoism and the military had been conspiring for a long time, but they got nothing. It could be called a fiasco. In that battle, Li Qingshan did not fight with the great divine priest of light face to face. But he knew that he lost, and the way he lost made him feel very humiliated. If he knew that the great divine priest was washing dishes at this time, would he feel better? Where on earth are you hiding? Stepping on the ebony floor, the nation master slowly walked out of the hall. He stood by the railing and watched the withered flowers and snow for a long time. Then he flicked his sleeves and left the southern gate temple. His eldest disciple, He Mingqi, hurried to follow him. He glanced at the clear sky and thought that it probably would not snow today, but he still clamped the yellow paper umbrella under his armpit. On the top floor of Wanyan Tower Temple, Monk Huangyang was transcribing Buddhist scriptures when he heard the sound behind him. He looked back and saw Li Qingshan's slightly haggard face. He sighed in his heart and stood up to greet him. He looked at his tired face and said, "According to the great divine priest of revelation, the Ming hand scroll should be resurrected in the wilderness and can't get away from the location of the front gate of the devil's doctrine. But a few days ago you calculated it, and the location indicated on the map by the cinnabar pen was the Hulun Sea. There is still some distance between the two places." It was quiet at the top of the pagoda. Huangyang did not have the habit of ordering the little monk around, so the conversation between the two could not be heard by others. Li Qingshan shook his head and said, "After all, the tomes of arcane is a sacred relic of Haotian Taoism. The imperial court really has no reason to take action. Our South School is in an even more awkward position. Now that the academy has taken it over, I will no longer care about this matter." Huangyang looked at him quietly and suddenly said, "Are you going to care about that matter all the time?" Li Qingshan said calmly, "The divine priest of light is in Chang'an. His Majesty will not allow the divine hall to send people here. That is my responsibility. As the nation master of Tang, I have the responsibility to protect the empire and this capital." Then he looked at Huangyang and said seriously, "You have to be careful these days." Monk Huangyang put his palms together and said slowly, "What kind of person is the divine priest of light? I am just a nobody who has nothing to do with the world and hides in a shabby pagoda copying scriptures. Why would he want to come and verify his cultivation with me?" After saying this, he walked to the edge of the pagoda and looked at the magnificent Chang'an under the clear winter sky. He said calmly with a smile, "If he really dares to come, although I am incompetent, if he does not show his real power, there is no reason to erase me from this world quietly." At that time, the big tactical array of Chang'an city can suppress him in an instant. Now, neither the West Hill Divine Palace nor the Tang Empire knew why the divine priest of light came to Chang'an city after escaping from the Peach Mountain. If it was because of the prophecy and the old matter more than a decade ago, it did not make sense. If he wanted to harm the Tang Empire, then Li Qingshan and Huangyang Monk were undoubtedly the most likely targets. In this case, Huangyang Monk's previous words had the compassion and fearlessness of feeding a tiger with his own body. Li Qingshan looked at the old monk's robe and shook his head after a moment of silence. He said, "We are too passive. We must find him first." Monk Huangyang turned around and found that there was a chessboard in front of Li Qingshan. Li Qingshan was reaching for the chess box. He was slightly surprised and said, "Are you going to make a divination again?" Li Qingshan put his right hand into the chess box and touched the slightly cold chess pieces. He nodded. Monk Huangyang frowned and said, "Your divination ability is at the cost of your lifespan. why do you do this? Li Qingshan said calmly, these days, senior brother has been looking for the divine priest of light in Chang'an city. Until today, he has still found nothing. He has taken such a big risk, so I have to do something. Master Yen Sei was the most powerful divine talisman master in the world. Even in the West Hill Divine Palace, he could be on an equal footing with the Hierarch Lord and the Great Divine Priest. Wei Guangming was the most powerful divine priest of light in hundreds of years. No one in the world knew who was more powerful. However, this kind of search and encounter was extremely disadvantageous to divine talisman masters. The crisp sound was like the spring rain coming to the world ahead of time. Dozens of chess pieces jumped and spun on the chessboard. Then, they calmed down and stopped moving. Li Qingshan had casually pulled out these chess pieces from the box, but it was very strange. There was only a single white piece, while the rest were all black. The black, matte stone chess pieces piled up silently on the left side of the chessboard, surrounding the white piece in the center. Li Qingshan looked at the chessboard in silence for a long time. Then he said, he is still in Chang'an, not far from us. Chang'an city seemed to have been stimulated by something this winter and became as moody as summer. It had been sunny last night and this morning, but after a while, the sky was covered by gray clouds and snowflakes were falling. He Mingqi looked up at the sky and heard the footsteps in the tower behind him. He quickly took out the yellow paper umbrella from under his armpit and opened it. Looking at the nation master's cheeks, which were even more haggard than before, he could not help but feel nervous. Returning from Wanyan Tower to Nanmengui, he Mingqi went straight to the kitchen and personally watched the handyman brew the medicine. As the eldest disciple of the Tang nation master, he did not have a very good aptitude for cultivation. He knew that he could not persuade his teacher not to waste his mind and even his lifespan to perform divination, so he could only do what he could. He held the boiling medicine bowl and slowly walked into the quiet Taoist temple. Li Qingshan sat by the window and looked at the flying snow outside. He did not look back when he heard the footsteps. He waved his hand to let him put down the medicine bowl. He Mingqi did not put down the medicine bowl. Instead, he knelt beside him and raised the medicine bowl with both hands, silently and stubbornly asking his teacher to take the medicine first. Li Qingshan sighed helplessly. He took the medicine bowl and drank it slowly. Then he sighed and said, "You are so silent and stubborn. Even if you are in charge of the Imperial Center administration, you are not suitable. If I die in the future, what will you do?" Beautiful Monday morning, please vote for Jiang Ye's youngest and freshest recommendation, Dear Big Guy. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 288. Your aptitude in cultivation is limited. You have made little progress in Taoism over the past 10 years. Your temperament is not suitable to deal with the civil and military officials in the court. Naturally, you can't be the master of the nation. But you are my disciple. Without the dazzling Taoist robe of the master of the nation, I'm afraid that the people you offended will harm you. Li Qingshan looked at his eldest disciple, his eyes full of worry and helplessness. He Mingqi lowered his head and answered, "I really don't have much ability. I've been used to serving master and uncle these years, doing some general affairs such as files. If you die in the future, I'll go to your grave to practice Taoism after I've finished the rest of the things I should do. I don't need to seek knowing destiny state, I just want to live a few more years. Guarding a lonely grave in the bitter wind and rain? That sounds a bit too bleak." Li Qingshan laughed out loud and then stopped smiling. He looked at He Mingqi and said, "His Majesty ordered you to supervise the first prince's study. I know you have a good relationship with him, but this matter will bring you great trouble in the future. In order to deal with those possible troubles, I think you should make some preparations in advance. At this point, his voice suddenly deepened. He Mingqi was slightly stunned. He moved his knees 2 steps forward and listened to the words that floated into his ears. His expression became more and more nervous. There was a look of disbelief in his eyes. He raised his head and was shocked speechless. Li Qingshan looked at his disciple and seriously exhorted, "When I met His Majesty in the past, we met at the fortune-telling stall outside the fragrance workshop. As long as I don't act recklessly, His Majesty will always allow me to fool around. I hope you can also become the first prince's partner or even friend. In this way, we can be master and disciple." He Mingqi was so touched that he knelt on the ground, completely speechless. Li Qingshan looked at him tenderly and said, "Go." He Mingqi left. Li Qingshan turned back and looked out of the window. Watching the slowly falling snowflakes, he was lost in thought. Everyone knew that although he was in a high position, he was born in the streets and was an interesting person who liked to laugh and scold. However, after sitting in the position of the master of the nation for such a long time, he had to think about the important matters in the court. He knew very well who would inherit the throne. As long as the academy kept its vow to stay out of politics, no one in the empire, be it the military or the prime minister, had the right to speak. It was all up to His Majesty. If His Majesty decided to let the second prince inherit the throne, then everything would be fine. If the emperor decided to let the eldest prince inherit the throne, would the empress really be willing? So many years had already passed, but Li Qingshan was still unable to understand why the emperor and empress would have such deep feelings for each other. However, he believed in his own eyes. He believed that the feelings between the emperor and empress were sincere. When His Majesty was present, the empress would willingly wash her hands in the depths of the palace, but what about after His Majesty left? He looked at the slowly falling snow outside the window and sighed softly. As the master of the Southern Gate Temple of Haotian, did he really dare to hope that the saintess of diabolism would let go of the supreme power of the Tang Empire? Last month, my uncle held a banquet in his mansion and wanted to introduce me to some officials in the court. However, 3 or 4 officials heard that I would also attend the banquet, so they turned back halfway and did not come to see me. And the day before yesterday, that woman held a banquet in the palace. All the officials with some status in the court sent their wives to the palace to flatter her. I think they even wanted to send their own mothers there. What on earth are they thinking? Don't they know that I am the eldest son? In a quiet courtyard, a young man dressed in bright yellow clothes sat on a chair and cursed at the falling snowflakes in front of the courtyard. There was no longer any morbid nobility on his pale and tender face, only endless hatred and resentment. Li Yu sat on a chair next to him and was watching the falling snow. Hearing this, she could not help but frown. The things that happened in the court recently made her a little uneasy, and now she was even more displeased. She scolded in a low voice, "That's our mother. What do you mean by that woman? It's even worse to criticize the officials so rudely." The young man in bright yellow clothes was the first prince, Li Huiyuan. Hearing his sister's scolding, he was a little shocked, but he still held his head high and said stubbornly, "Sister, we only have one mother. I don't think she is qualified to be our mother. Those officials are very unbearable in themselves. What's wrong with me saying a few words?" Li Yu looked into his eyes and said solemnly, "As the successor of the Tang Empire, there are countless eyes watching you in the dark. So you have to pay more attention to your words and actions at all times." Li Huiyuan sneered and said, "The problem is that father didn't make me the crown prince. That's enough." Li Yu slightly frowned and asked, "How are your studies in the Imperial College?" Li Huiyuan shrugged and showed an indifferent expression on his pale face. "Father asked He Mingqi to watch me every day. It's impossible for me to play truant even if I want to. Don't worry, the grand secretaries all say that I'm diligent. Li Yu saw that he did not seem to be pretending and felt a little better. She reminded him, He Mingqi is also in charge of the affairs of the Imperial Center Administration. He also has to watch you study. It's very hard. Don't be angry at him. Li Huiyuan did not understand why she suddenly mentioned this. He said confusedly, I have a close relationship with Mingqi. Of course I won't be angry at him. But why are you so cautious about this? Li Yu looked at the falling snow in front of the courtyard and said slowly, a few days ago, the Academy, the Imperial Court and the Southern Gate Temple finally reached a consensus that Ning Ke would not be a visiting professor of the Southern Gate Temple, but would directly take over the position of the Nation Master. But He Mingqi is after all the Nation Master's disciple and is deeply loved by the Nation Master. It's crucial for us to get the support of the South School of Haotian Taoism. Although I haven't asked him, I believe he will support us because of my relationship with Mingqi. Li Huiyuan thought that even if He Mingqi could inherit the influence of the Nation Master Li Qingshan in the South School of Haotian Taoism in the future, he would not be able to sit on the position of the Nation Master. He could not help but feel a little regretful. He touched his head and sighed, I'm afraid that Ning Ke will be a key in the future. I don't know how to make him surrender. Hearing this, Li Yu raised her thin eyebrows and scolded, I told you to be careful. But you dare to say anything. As a core disciple of the headmaster of the academy, who in the world is qualified to say that he will surrender? Li Huiyuan could not hide his arrogance and said contemptuously, even if I can't do it now, when I sit on the throne in the future, there will be countless masters in the Imperial Center Administration and thousands of soldiers in the military. Do you think I will be afraid of him? Hearing this, Li Yu was angry and disappointed. She stared at him and said in a low voice, the academy does not interfere in the court affairs and obeys the law of the Tang Empire. That is the rule set by the headmaster of the academy. But the court is not able to make them follow this rule. If you want to sit on the throne safely, you must remember that you must maintain respect for the academy in front of others and behind the scenes. Do you hear me? Li Huiyuan was shocked by the anger in her eyes. He felt a chill in his heart and nodded subconsciously. Then, to make her happy, he held her hand and shook it gently. He said with a smile, I know, sister. No one in the world is qualified to say that he will surrender to the academy. But I believe you can make Ning Ke surrender. Hearing this, Li Yu thought of the bonfire on the journey, the story beside the bonfire, and the lad carrying 3 knives on his back. She could not help laughing at herself and said lightly, I don't have that ability. At this time, a nanny came up and said softly, the young prince is awake. Miss Sang Sang told him a couple of stories and brought him here. Li Yu glanced at her brother and said, you go back to the palace first. Father will test you again tonight. Li Huiyuan was puzzled and said, what's there to be afraid of? Father has never opposed me and my brother being close. Li Yu frowned and said helplessly, you have a bad temper. It's better to stay away from you. Sang Sang seems to be indifferent, but her heart is as clear as a mirror. You can't hide your boring thoughts from her. Li Huiyuan was so angry that he laughed and said, she is just a little handmaiden. Why should I stay away from her? Li Yu did not bother to explain anything to him. She directly picked him up from the chair and summoned the eunuchs in the palace. She told them to escort him back to the palace quickly. Looking at the yellow figure disappearing at the stone gate of the garden, she could not help but shake her head. Although her brother had made a lot of progress in the past year, he was still young after all. There were still many things he did not understand. Sang Sang was indeed a very ordinary and even lowly handmaiden. Her status was certainly far from that of a prince of the Tang Empire. However, Li Yu was very clear that this little handmaiden was the key to making Ning Ke surrender and getting close to the academy. Putting the brush on the inkstone, Li Yu looked at the small regular script she had written and turned to ask, what do you think of my calligraphy? Do you still like them? Sang Sang shook her head and said, I don't know how to judge the quality of calligraphy. As long as it is neat, I think it looks good. Li Yu did not believe her and said with a smile, your young master is one of the famous calligraphers in the world. You have followed him for so many years. How can you not know the quality of calligraphy? How can you praise him when he is grinding ink and adding incense in the middle of the night? Sang Sang opened her bright willowy eyes and said seriously, young master's calligraphy is naturally good. He doesn't need to think of words. Li Yu thought about the meaning of her words and found the pair of master and handmaiden more and more interesting. She joked and said, in your eyes, Ning Ke is the best in everything he does. I really don't know how the two of you got along with each other like this. Now that he has been away from Chang'an for some time, are you used to it? Do you miss him at night? Since returning to Chang'an from the city of Wei, Sang Sang often met with Li Yu. The Tang princess and the little handmaiden really had some affection for each other and did not care about their status when they talked. However, when she heard this, Sang Sang was probably a little embarrassed and actually threw a little tantrum. She turned around with a cold face and ignored her. Li Yu smiled. She was very clear that this kind of teasing could only be used occasionally in the conversation to shorten the psychological distance between the two. The little handmaiden seemed to be embarrassed and annoyed, but in fact, she should be happy with the hidden meaning in this kind of teasing. However, Sang Sang was still young and probably did not know what this kind of emotion was. She did not even know why she was embarrassed and annoyed. Ning Ke, who was not in Chang'an, was obviously in a state of confusion. Sang Sang stood by the courtyard and looked at the falling snow outside. Her slender figure in the background of the messy snow formed a somewhat lonely and touching picture with some kind of hope. Li Yu quietly looked at this picture and put the figure of Ning Ke's back beside the little handmaiden in her mind. She found that the picture instantly became rich and harmonious, without the slightest incongruity. She silently sighed and dispelled the trace of envy and regret in her heart. Thinking of a certain news, she softly asked, I heard that you recently took in a lonely old man in the old brush pen shop. Sang Sang was slightly startled, turned around and nodded. Li Yu looked at her slightly dark and thin little face and felt a surge of love in her heart. She seriously reminded her, although Chang'an is peaceful and there are people watching over the shop, you should still be careful about this kind of thing. Sang Sang felt the concern and affection in her highness's words and seriously comforted her, it's okay. He is very honest. The great divine priest of light, who had led 2 bloody cases in the world more than 10 years ago and whose hands were stained with the blood of hundreds and thousands of innocent people, could be described as honest? This was a question worth thinking about. But the old brush pen shop was indeed fine. Thanks to Ning Ke's numerous solemn requests before he left Chang'an, the Lin 47th Street now looked as lively and noisy as usual. In fact, the imperial palace's bodyguards often secretly came over to inspect, the Chang'an local government's runners patrolled more than 5 times a day, and the Fish Dragon gang never left to protect the shop from dawn to dusk. Today, apart from the imperial palace, this inconspicuous alley was probably the safest in Chang'an. What was strange was that whether it was the imperial palace bodyguards, the Chang'an local government or the Fish Dragon gang that ruled the underground world of Chang'an, they were all carrying out another order recently. They were looking for an old man. However, no one would have thought that the old man they were looking for was in the bookshop that they were guarding. In the evening, Sang Sang was worried about the old man's food and came back from the princess mansion early. She took out the key to open the shop door and walked to the patio to have a look. As expected, the old man was squatting by the stove, preparing to heat the leftovers. She could not help but frown and opened the food box that she brought back from the princess mansion. She said, "Eat this." A few days ago, she had tried to let the old man cook. But that night, she saw the blackened rice and the half-empty woodpile beside the stove. She decided not to try this again in order to save rice and dry wood. Just when the old and the young were about to eat dinner, there was a knock on the door. Sang Sang got up and was about to open the door when she suddenly thought of something. She lowered her head and continued eating. The old man understood. He brushed a grain of rice off the front of his cotton-padded jacket and got up to open the door. The door of the old brush pen shop was opened. A monk was standing at the bottom of the stairs. The monk was very young and wore a tattered frock. He had a handsome face and seemed to be above the mortal world. The monk was surprised to find that it was the old man who opened the door. He said, "I'm not looking for you." The old man was stunned. He turned around and said, "I'm looking for you." Sang Sang walked over with a bowl of rice. She looked at the young monk and frowned for a while. She remembered that she had seen this person by the meadow outside the academy when Ning Kei climbed the mountain to the second floor. The monk's eyes suddenly brightened when he saw Sang Sang's little black face. He recited excitedly in a trembling voice, "Beautiful girl, the love monk Wu Dao has finally found you. These days, I have made a few new poems for you. You're the flower on the cliff, waiting for me to pluck it. You're the fish in the lake, entangled in a net made of aquatic plants. You're the biggest obstacle on the way to the other side. I'm willing to stay with you and never leave." Sang Sang listened to the words like flower and fish and glanced at the yellow croaker in the bowl. Please vote enthusiastically to encourage me, who is a little depressed and restless. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 289. Sang Sang didn't think this poem was good. She thought it was worse than the one she wrote for Ning Kei to kill people. She also remembered that this monk had threatened her and Ning Kei outside the academy, so she turned around and closed the door. The door was blocked by Wu Dao's hand. He didn't hide the obsession and crazy possessiveness on his face. He looked at Sang Sang and said excitedly, "I promise you that I will kill your young master as soon as possible so that you can freely follow me to the ends of the earth to see the ebb and flow of the tide and the blossom and wither of the flowers." Hearing this, Sang Sang turned around and looked at his face seriously. Wu Dao looked at the little handmaiden's serious expression and became more and more intoxicated. He reached out his hand and wanted to touch her face. As his fingertips approached the slightly dark face, he seemed to be able to clearly feel the clear and intoxicating smell of Sang Sang seeping into his body. He breathed a little quickly and said very seriously, "I have never met a girl who can make me so excited in my life. You must be mine." When he said these words, his expression was solemn and dignified, without any greedy or infatuated expression. His tattered monk robe was fluttering in the wind, but every pore on his handsome face seemed to be flowing with a feverish body fluid, and every word seemed to spread obscenity into the wind. Sang Sang took a step back to avoid the wet and sticky fingers that were like the tongue of a poisonous snake. She looked at the monk's slightly bulging crotch. There was no disgusting or even any emotion on her face. She turned around and reached out to take a basin. The wooden basin was filled with yesterday's vegetable washing water, which was specially stored for flushing the toilet. The old man sneaked back to the backyard and took out the basin of water. He waited calmly by the side. Sang Sang took the basin of water, raised her arms and splashed the water in front of her. There was a splash. The dirty water mixed with mud splashed on Wu Dao, drenching him from head to toe. 2 yellow and smelly rotten vegetable leaves drooped on his shiny bald head. The dignified and serious expression on his face suddenly froze. With a bang, the wooden door of the old brush pen shop was closed tightly. Wu Dao, who was soaking wet, stood at the bottom of the stone steps in a daze. After a long time, he came to his senses. He reached out his hand to wipe off the muddy water on his face. He slowly picked off 2 rotten leaves from the top of his head. A smile gradually appeared on his solemn face. During the 2 encounters with Sang Sang, he did not hide his greed, excitement, and fanaticism. But at this time, a basin of water was poured over his head, and his heart was drenched. For the first time, the smile on his face showed coldness and indifference. That was because Wu Dao was very pained and angry. He could not suppress his excitement and knocked on the wooden door of the old brush pen shop. Finally, he got a basin of dirty water and 2 pieces of rotten vegetables. It did not matter. The passion and the inexplicable attraction in his heart could not be extinguished by a basin of water. He was Wu Dao, the love monk. Since he left the Xiankong temple, he had traveled around the world. Whether it was the Yueluan kingdom or the South Jin kingdom, countless girls from rich and poor families had fallen for him. How could he be frustrated in front of a little handmaiden? Wu Dao smiled and walked in the alley under the winter trees. Thinking that his wish was about to be fulfilled, he felt happy and calm. The old man looked through the frame of the wooden door and looked at the back of the young monk who was walking to the entrance of the alley. He thought in silence, a lascivious monk could actually feel the uniqueness of Sang Sang. The Xiankong temple is indeed extraordinary. Walking back to the backyard, he found that the basin of water for washing vegetables was thrown to the corner. Sang Sang did not return to the table to eat. Instead, she squatted beside the stove and stared at the weak but pure divine light on her fingertips in a daze. "You don't want to eat anymore?" the old man asked. Sang Sang shook her head and flicked her fingers. The dry firewood in the stove was quickly ignited. However, she frowned. The old man smiled and said, "There are people in Buddhism who are crazy about karmic cultivation. That's probably why the monk was crazy." Sang Sang ignored him. She held her chin and stared at the burning firewood in the stove. She was seriously thinking about how to quickly improve her divine skill. Her current state was too low. The Haotian divine light that she could condense was weak and weak. Its power was similar to that of ordinary fire. It could ignite firewood, but it could not deal with those powerful cultivators. The old man looked at the determined expression on her little face and sighed. He said, "Mental obstacles are very bad for cultivation." Sang Sang did not turn her head and said softly, "He said he wanted to kill young master as soon as possible." She said nothing else and did not make any request. But the old man knew very well why she was so eager to improve her state. She wanted to kill the young monk as soon as possible. The old man looked at Sang Sang's back and smiled without saying anything. The night had just arrived. The twilight was still stubbornly in the west. It was dinner time. There was no one in an alley in the east of Chang'an City. The winter trees along the alley drew countless irregular small squares in the dark sky. Wu Dao withdrew his gaze from the sky and was about to move forward with a smile. However, the next moment, his pupils suddenly shrank. There was a person at the entrance of the alley. He could not see his face clearly in the dim light. But judging from his stooped body, he should be an old man. What made him vigilant was that he did not know when the old man appeared at the entrance of the alley. Wu Dao was silent for a moment and walked toward the entrance of the alley. He was closer and could see the face clearly. He found that he had seen this old man before. It was in the shop on Lin 47th Street. The basin of water left for washing vegetables was in the hands of this old man. The old man standing at the entrance of the alley looked at him and smiled. He said kindly, "You can see Sang Sang's potential. You have a good eye. Among the young cultivators, you are outstanding." Wu Dao gently raised his hand and slowly stroked his bald head. His movement was very natural and unrestrained. But he could still feel the slippery water and the 2 sticky rotten leaves between his fingers. But he did not want to do anything. Because this stooped figure who looked like an ordinary old man was definitely not an ordinary person. Because he could block his way at the entrance of the alley without Wudao noticing, and because he knew what cultivation was. After all, Wudao was a proud young man. He thought that he was on par with Prince Longqing. He would never accept an unknown old man teaching him a lesson. He proudly said, "So her name is Sang Sang. I see. You can leave now." The old man smiled and said, "I know you are from Xiankong Temple." Wudao's expression changed slightly. He did not expect that the old man could see through him at a glance. The old man calmly said, "Xiankong Temple rarely expel disciples. But your state is much lower than Qi Nian's. Naturally, you are not qualified to represent the temple in the world. So I don't understand why you appear in the secular world." Wudao's expression changed again. He did not expect that the old man knew so much about Xiankong Temple. He even knew senior brother Qi Nian. He subconsciously became alert. His ragged frock danced in the wind. He looked at the old man and said in a low voice, "Since you know that I come from the unknown place, why do you still dare to block my way?" The old man smiled and said, "The so-called unknown place is just a place that people don't know about. Once people know about it, they will know. So the name of a temple is something that has no power or meaning." Hearing this, Wudao became more alert. He looked at the old man in silence. Let's say that many people in Chang and city know about Xiankong Temple and Jishou Abbey. Moreover, the academy is at the foot of the mountain in the south of the city. So your background is nothing to the people in this city. It's just that Chang and city has been distracted by something recently. Yen Sei has no time to care about you, and others have no time to care about you. That's why you can be so presumptuous. Otherwise, do you really think that the name of Xiankong Temple can frighten the Tangs? The Buddhist sect's handprint exuded an exquisite and grand aura, but when it came into contact with the candle-like flame on the old man's finger, it was like snow meeting the spring sun, or mud entering the basin used to wash vegetables, instantly disappearing. Wudao's figure seemed to be tied up by the light of the flame. His feet in straw sandals could not leave the ground. His body was stretched like a shadow, but he could not go far. He looked at the candle-like flame between the old man's fingers and his eyes were full of fear. The milky color of the flame occupied his black pupils and then quickly expanded, drowning out the fear. Then his black pupils were burning. Shrill screams sounded in the quiet alley. Light is pure and clean, so it is the purest and easiest to be polluted. Light is pure and cold, so it is the most fanatical and cruel. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 290. When the old man returned to the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street, Sang Sang was still squatting in front of the stove, frowning at the burning firewood and thinking about the divine skills she had learned daily. "Let's eat," the old man said. Sang Sang had been in a trance and did not notice that the old man had left for a while. She was startled when she heard this. She stood up and looked at the edge of the old man's wet clothes. She vaguely understood something, and her lips slowly curled up into a smile. The old man also smiled and sat down at the table. Sang Sang didn't ask him what he had done when he left the old brush pen shop. She served him a bowl of rice and heated the yellow croaker. She picked up the fattest one and put it on the rice pile in his bowl. Then she poured a spoonful of delicious steaming soup. What did Aunt Wu cook for lunch? Lettuce with chopped garlic. Sang Sang asked, "Is it delicious?" The old man answered, "Not bad, but I don't understand why she didn't put salted fish in it." Sang Sang raised her head and asked in confusion, "Why did she put salted fish in it?" The old man was puzzled and looked at her little face, "But you put it in when you made lettuce last time." Sang Sang lowered her head and said, "When young master made lettuce, he didn't even put chopped garlic in it." The old man was startled and sighed with emotion, "Well, I remember that the vegetables we ate in the Taoist temple didn't even have oil. I don't know why. Now that I'm old, I'm coveting these extravagant pleasures." Young master said it's easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. Everyone is the same. Teacher, you don't have to blame yourself. Sang Sang comforted him. The next day at dawn, the old man got up and carefully folded the bedding on the table and put it back in the corner behind the shelf. Then he opened the door of the old brush pen shop and looked at the distant morning light, squinting his eyes. Last night, Sang Sang told him that it's easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but difficult to go from extravagance to frugality, which somehow touched him. He found that he was too coveting the life in the old brush pen shop and forgot to look for the shadow of the night. They still had hot and sour noodle slice soup in the morning. When the old man was about to wash the dishes, Sang Sang signaled her to let him rest. The old man smiled and said that he was going out for a walk today and might not come back for lunch. It's good to go out for a walk. It's not good to be cooped up at home all day. After thinking for a while, Sang Sang took out a piece of silver from her belt and handed it to him. She told him, "If you're tired and want to sit in a tea house, just sit there. Don't be stingy with money. Just don't go too far. If you can't remember the way, don't be embarrassed to ask others. People in Chang'an are very friendly." If you can't remember the way, just find a casino and tell them that you are Mr. Chi. Someone will take you back. The old man was afraid of his female disciples nagging, so he carefully took the silver fragments and put them in his pocket. After repeatedly saying yes, he left the room. After leaving Lin 47th Street, he went all the way to the north, passing through the Imperial Palace in the eastern city and exiting Chang'an and through the Xuanwu Gate. Finally, he came to a hill covered with winter snow in the north of the city. Looking afar from a high vantage point, one could naturally see into the distance. The old man looked towards the north in silence. The morning star was dim, as if it was about to be absorbed into Haotian's body of light. The plum trees in the back garden of the Southern Gate Temple were covered with a thin layer of snow. The nation master, Li Qingshan, leaned lazily on the windowsill, looking at the snow on the plum trees and the little buds that seemed to never bloom. Suddenly, he coughed violently. The sound of his coughing echoed in the quiet hall of the Taoist temple. It sounded extremely painful. Releasing the handkerchief that covered his mouth, the bright red blood stains on the snow-white handkerchief looked like plum blossoms in full bloom. He angrily looked at the plum trees outside the window and scolded, "They should have bloomed in the winter, but they never did. You just had to let me bloom a few first." The Taoist nuns and Taoist boys of the Southern Gate silently waited outside the hall. Their faces were full of worry, but no one dared to enter. He Mingqi walked over with a bowl of medicine and signaled a senior sister to take the yellow paper umbrella away from his armpit. He walked up to the dark, smooth paulownia floor and walked behind Li Qingshan. He said painfully, "Master, you can't do divination anymore." Li Qingshan took the bowl of medicine and slowly drank it. He folded the blood-stained handkerchief and wiped away the medicine left on his beard. He looked at his favorite disciple and said expressionlessly, "Wei Guangming showed up last night. He is indeed still in Chang'an. He is limited to the 3 workshops, but he seems to be leaving. We have to hurry up on this matter." He Mingqi took the bowl of medicine and said, "The military ministry and the Imperial Center administration have already begun their preparations. They are just worried that they will alarm that person, so they haven't entered the north street of the fragrance workshop to search yet. Only Uncle Master is there now. Thinking about how his senior brother was currently searching for that powerful, terrifying bastard in the eastern city all by himself, Li Qingshan nodded after a very long period of silence. He said nothing more. He waved his hand, dispersing the people outside the hall and dismissing the disciples. A black horse carriage was traveling slowly on the streets of the eastern city of Chang'an. He could not help but be slightly stunned, and then he frowned and said, "The shop door is closed in the daytime. How can we do business?" Sang Sang explained, "If the shop door is open, the threshold will be trampled by people who come to rob the calligraphy sections." The young fat man was stunned for a while and thought that it was indeed reasonable. He actually forgot Ning Kei's great reputation in Chang'an. He looked at the little handmaiden and asked, "My name is Chen Pipi. Have you ever heard of me from Ning Kei?" Sang Sang was not surprised when she heard the name. She slightly bowed and said, "Sang Sang greets you, child Chen." Chen Pipi rubbed his round and cute chin and looked up and down at the skinny little girl in front of him. He suddenly shook his head and said, "Ning Kei really has a reason to ask me to take care of you. Although I was born with an extraordinary temperament and I can tell that I'm not an ordinary person, you are still too gullible. I'm afraid there will be problems." Sang Sang said, "I know you are Chen Pipi." She had been to the academy several times, but the two had never met each other. Chen Pipi believed that there was absolutely no problem with his arrogant memory, so he asked confusedly, "Why are you so sure that I am a genius?" Sang Sang looked at him and explained seriously, "Young master often mentioned you. He said that people who are so fat but not ugly are not wretched and disgusting. He even said that there are not many good-looking people. So I know you are you." Chen Pipi's right hand that was rubbing his chin slightly stiffened. He wondered how Ning Kei had slandered him in front of the little handmaiden. He also felt that although the evaluation mentioned that he was fat, it seemed to be somewhat useful. He did not know how to answer. "Let's not talk about this." Chen Pipi coughed twice and pretended to be serious and mature. He looked at Sang Sang and said, "Today I come here to see you at Ning Kei's request. After all, as a senior brother, I have the responsibility and obligation." He very much hoped that Sang Sang could show a moved expression, but Sang Sang obviously did not have such a reaction. She just looked at him expressionlessly and softly thanked him. Then she went to make a bowl of cheap jasmine tea for him. Chen Pipi looked at her back and said, "Youngest brother said that he would invite me here for a meal. He said that you are good at cooking." Sang Sang looked at his chubby face and frowned. No wonder he looked like this. But she did not intend to keep him. She put the teacup beside him and softly said, "When young master comes back, Sang Sang will cook for young master Chen." What she wanted to express was very obvious. Ning Kei should wait for him to invite you for a meal. It was impossible for you to barge in and ask for food. Don't you need to add more food with more chopsticks? With your figure, you need at least 2 more dishes, right? If it has to be meat dishes, how much more will it cost? Hearing this, Chen Pipi's self-esteem was hit. Looking at the jasmine petals in the bowl, the fat on his face slightly twitched. He had to decide to tell the truth. Ning Kei said that there is a person smarter than me in this shop. I always think it is impossible, so I want to confirm it. Sang Sang looked around the shop and did not find anyone hiding. Chen Pipi covered his forehead and said helplessly, "He said that the smartest person in the world is you." Sang Sang was stunned. She thought that Ning Kei always said that she was stupid. How could he say that she was smart? Although she was very happy to be praised by young master as the smartest person in the world, she was still very confused about this statement. She frowned and thought for a long time. Suddenly she thought of something and said shyly, "I am not smart. I just have a good memory." Chen Pipi looked at her with a scornful smile and said, I don't believe that there is anyone in the world who is better than me in memory. Sang Sang looked down at the small toe of the cotton skirt and did not want to argue with him. Ning Kei's cultivation is not good, and his knowledge is also extremely poor. My talent was once recognized by Haotian Taoism and the back mountain of the academy. I don't know what he is thinking. How dare he say that you are better than me? Seeing her like this, Chen Pipi became even more angry and said angrily, Why are you looking at the shoe? Do you think I will make things difficult for you? Although she knew that Ning Kei was close to this young master Chen, Sang Sang, who was quiet and even a little dull, was a little angry when she heard him mock her young master. She looked up at Chen Pipi's eyes and said very seriously, My memory is also recognized by the city of Wei. This was the truth. During the years she lived in the city of Wei, she was always the most popular notary because she had the best memory and could not lie. However, the city of Wei and the Jishou Abbey. The difference between the two places was too big. But Sang Sang still looked so serious and did not feel embarrassed at all. It was as if she wanted to tell Chen Pipi that since the city of Wei recognized her good memory, then it was really good. As long as it was recognized in the world, as long as there were two people, they would not recognize each other. This was probably the principle that there was no second place in martial arts, especially when facing Sang Sang's temperament. Chen Pipi wanted to prove that he was smarter and had a better memory than her, but it was useless to rely on words. He had to show some real skills. Let's compete, Chen Pipi said. Sang Sang was not interested in competing with others in terms of intelligence or memory. She thought of the pine branches under the cured meat in the backyard and would not agree to his request. She walked back to the backyard and picked up the pine branches with a wooden stick to make the smoke bigger. Then she took out a new urn from the kitchen and squatted by the well to wash it carefully. A few days ago, she made a pot of chicken soup. The old man drank it happily and dipped a lot of soup in his beard. She thought that the young master also liked to drink the chicken soup she made. If she used the old urn to make chicken soup when he came back, the amount might not be enough. So she went to a small shop in Onping Lane and bought a new urn. She thought that she could make 2 urns of chicken soup in the future, which should be enough. Chen Pipi looked at the back of the little handmaiden who was busy and kept pestering her. I don't care. You have to defeat me with something today. Otherwise, I won't let you go. Are there any books in the shop? Let's compete in reciting books. The one who loses will treat the other to dinner. If you think it's boring, let's bet money. Hearing the word money, Sang Sang suddenly stopped washing the urn. She looked back at Chen Pipi. Then she stood up and wiped her little red hands on her apron. She turned around and walked into the bedroom. After a while, she came out with a little red face. She said shyly and regretfully, Young master, I can't understand those talisman books, and I can't read other books. Have I not spoken for a long time? Well, I waved my hand. Hello everyone. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. After a long time, he looked at the closed door and said bitterly, I have never heard of anyone who would be so bored to look at the banknotes at home every day. You even memorized the words on the banknotes. Ning Kei acted as if he had never seen silver in his 8 lifetimes. Today he knows that he is much worse than a greedy girl like you. What kind of people are you and your servant? Sang Sang tightly held the box of banknotes and nervously leaned against the wooden door. What if he forced his way in? Listening to the loud curses and heart-wrenching education coming from outside the door, she was scared and wanted to laugh. Yes, She had said that no one would be so bored to look at the banknotes, but she did not expect Chen Pipi to really believe her. In her opinion, before Ning Kei's calligraphy could be exchanged for banknotes, the banknotes were the most beautiful pieces of paper in the world. And counting the banknotes in the middle of the night was the most interesting thing in the world. Chen Pipi shouted outside the door, "Come out." Sang Sang leaned against the door with her back, lowered her head and said softly, "The banknotes are mine." Chen Pipi covered his forehead and said, "I admit that they are yours." Sang Sang raised her head and asked curiously, "Then why did I come out?" Chen Pipi said angrily, "The banknotes are yours, but you cheated in the previous round. You have to do it again." Sang Sang lifted the bedboard and hid the box of banknotes. She shouted to the door, "Child Chen, it's getting late. You should hurry back to the academy." Chen Pipi was stunned. He looked at the sky and shouted angrily, "It's not even lunchtime. What do you mean by early?" Sang Sang walked behind the door and said humbly, "Child Chen, I admit that I am not as smart as you and have a better memory than you." Chen Pipi became angrier. He shook his head and sighed, "Tisk tsk, you are willing to admit anything after winning 100 taels of silver?" Sang Sang said, "Young master has said that fame and fortune are fleeting clouds. There is no need to fight for it." Chen Pipi was so angry that he was speechless. He thought that she should at least remove the word fortune from the word fame and fortune. He stepped forward and hammered the wooden door twice, shouting, "Since you are not afraid of losing to me, why don't you play another round with me?" Sang Sang thought that it was indeed reasonable. She had won 100 taels of silver from him, so she had to appease his anger. She pushed the door open and said seriously to Chen Pipi, "But you are not allowed to gamble again. Gambling is not good." How could he be so shameless just so that he wouldn't lose the money back? Chen Pipi was even more speechless. He looked at the little handmaiden's slightly black cheeks and wondered what Ning Kei had taught her. He said in a low voice, "Play chess." Sang Sang answered simply, "I don't know how to play chess." Chen Pipi did not believe it at all. The little girl in front of him had seen banknotes before, but it was not an ordinary person's ability to remember the numbers of more than 30 banknotes. He said, "Of course." Sang Sang's answer was more concise this time. She nodded and said, "Oh." The chessboard was borrowed from Boss Wu next door. It looked antique, but since Boss Wu opened a fake antique shop, it was naturally fake. However, the black and white chess pieces were sparsely placed on the chessboard, and it did look a little special. Chen Pipi did not feel that he had met his match, nor did he feel proud of being lonely at the top. He pointed at the black chess piece on the chessboard and looked at Sang Sang, puzzled, and asked, "How can I play here?" Sang Sang looked at him with her eyes wide open and asked, puzzled, "Why can't I play here?" Chen Pipi carefully explained to her the problem of such a way to play, and then asked in puzzlement, "You are a very smart person, and you have such a good memory. After understanding the rules, you only need to use your brain a little to figure out the problem. Why don't you think more about it?" Sang Sang answered seriously, "It's hard to think about things. I don't usually think about it." Chen Pipi was dumbfounded, and he could not put down the chess piece between his thick and round fingers. At this moment, a voice came from the door of the old brush pen shop, "Playing chess." Sang Sang looked at the door and said in surprise, "You're back so early?" The old man stepped over the threshold and walked in. He nodded, took out some silver from his waist and handed it to her. "I didn't drink tea." Sang Sang stood up and made way for the old man to take her place. She said, "I'm going to take a look at the bacon. Aunt Wu said that at the beginning of the smoking, the fat of fresh meat would drip oil easily. I have to be careful of the pine branches burning. You take my place, and I'll give you some tea later." The old man nodded and sat down on the chair. He looked up at Chen Pipi and said, "Who should play?" Chen Pipi looked at the old face in front of him, looked at his pure eyes, looked at the holy light in his eyes, and thought of the thing that made Chang and City uneasy these days. This time, he was really dumbfounded. His fingers holding the black chess piece slightly trembled, and he did not know whether to put it back on the chessboard or back into the urn. The old man looked down at the situation on the chessboard and continued to ask, who should play? Chen Pipi said honestly, I should play. After saying this, he stood up and was ready to walk out of the old brush pen shop. The old man raised his head and looked at him in confusion. He said, I mean, who should play? Chen Pipi looked at him for a long time, and then he slowly sat back in the chair. The black chess piece between his fingers fell down gently. The old man put his hand into the urn and took out a white chess piece. He did not put it down for a long time, as if he was thinking about how to deal with it. Today is the 3rd anniversary of the birth of the spy. I miss Su Lu, Shi Qing Hai, the 7 groups of tigers, the men in these books. I believe you all know that the simplified Chinese publication of the coming night has begun. I will inform you of the details on another day. As for the simplified Chinese publication of the spy, I will try my best to finish it as soon as possible. Tomorrow is Saturday, and I wish you all a happy weekend. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.